When my son claimed bankruptcy, I mortgaged the home my late wife left me to keep his family afloat. Weeks later, my mute grandson gripped my hand, forced out 3 words: "Check Dad's basement." And everything I believed collapsed. My name is Thomas Gallagher. I am 68 years old, and for 45 years I broke my back as a heavy diesel mechanic. I pulled 60-hour weeks breathing in harsh exhaust and scrubbing thick black grease out of my cracked knuckles so my family would never know the cold, bitter bite of poverty. But as I dropped my 2 heavy canvas bags onto the floor of my son's guest room, my shoulders ached with a pain that went far deeper than my aging bones. The dull thud of those bags felt like the final gavel striking down on my life. I was standing in a house that was not mine, breathing recycled air that smelled like expensive vanilla diffusers, stripping away the very last ounce of my pride. Just 3 months ago, I had a home. It was a modest, sturdy brick house at the end of a quiet suburban street. My late wife Sarah and I paid it off over 30 grueling years. Every drop of sweat I poured into those massive diesel engines was for that house for her, and for our only son, Liam. When Sarah passed away, that house became my sanctuary. It held the sweet echoes of her laughter, the smell of her Sunday pot roasts, and the warmth of a simple life well lived. I thought I would take my last breath in that living room. I thought my legacy was safe and secure. Then came the rainy Tuesday evening, when Liam showed up at my kitchen table trembling and weeping like a lost child. He told me his logistics brokerage was facing total bankruptcy. He sat there burying his face in his perfectly manicured hands, sobbing that he was going to lose absolutely everything. His house, his business, his ability to feed his wife Chloe and my 7-year-old grandson Leo. He begged me for help. He said the aggressive creditors were closing in, and he needed a lifeline just enough to restructure his mounting debts and keep his young family off the street. What does a father do when his only child is drowning? You do not hesitate. You do not ask for a rigid business plan. You reach out your hand and pull them up, even if it means pulling yourself under the water. The very next morning, I drove down to the local bank and signed the heavy stack of paperwork. I mortgaged the fully paid-off home Sarah and I had built together. I handed my son a certified check for $300,000. I told him to fix his life to protect my grandson and to make things right. I trusted my boy with absolute blind faith. But the money vanished like water poured into dry sand. 3 months later, the terrifying foreclosure notices started arriving in my mailbox. Liam stood in my driveway, refusing to look me in the eye, and coldly announced that the $300,000 was not enough to appease the corporate creditors. He told me they were officially filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in the morning. He said my house was gone. The bank took my keys, changing the locks on 40 years of irreplaceable memories, and I was forced to pack what little I had left into a few cardboard boxes. That is how I ended up here, an old, defeated man intruding in my son's downsized suburban home. But as I looked around the pristine guest room, a sickening knot began to form deep in my stomach. Liam claimed they had to downsize to survive the brutal bankruptcy, but this house did not feel like the home of a family in financial ruin. The hardwood floors were spotless and expensive. Chloe walked down the hallway in designer heels, her face twisted in a perpetual scowl of sheer disgust whenever she had to pass my door. Her brother Travis was always lingering around the property, driving a brand-new imported sports car that completely contradicted the story of a shattered family business. But the heaviest, most agonizing weight in this house was not the financial mystery. It was my grandson Leo. Leo is 7 years old, and he has not spoken a single word in 2 full years. The doctors and expensive specialists Chloe hired called it selective mutism. They casually dismissed it as a phase, a temporary trauma response to his parents stressing over the failing business. But I know what a terrified child looks like. Every time Liam entered a room, Leo would violently flinch. His small shoulders would draw up toward his ears, and he would make himself as small as physically possible. Whenever Travis was over, the boy would practically fold himself into the dark shadows behind the furniture. I sat on the edge of the stiff guest bed, rubbing my swollen knees, feeling the crushing guilt that I had failed my family. I had lost Sarah's legacy, and I could not even get my own grandson to smile. I felt completely useless, a silent ghost lingering in the background of my son's massive failure. That night, the house was dead silent. I was lying awake, staring blindly at the ceiling, listening to the heavy rain tap against the window pane. Around 2 a.m, the door to my room slowly creaked open. A small, trembling shadow slipped inside. It was Leo. He crept up to the side of my bed, his breathing incredibly shallow and rapid. I sat up quickly, thinking he had suffered a bad nightmare. I reached out to comfort him, to offer him a piece of butterscotch candy I kept on the nightstand, the kind Sarah used to carry in her purse for him. But Leo ignored the sweet candy. He reached out and gripped my calloused hand with a desperate, terrifying strength. His small, cold fingers dug deeply into my skin. He looked back toward the dark hallway, his eyes wide with a pure, unadulterated terror that no 7-year-old boy should ever know. Then, the heavy silence of 2 long years broke. His small chest heaved, and in a raspy, fragile whisper that sounded like it had been dragged through broken glass, he forced out 3 impossible words. "Check Dad's basement." My blood ran completely cold. Before I could ask him what he meant, before I could even process the sheer shock of hearing his voice, a floorboard creaked out in the hallway. Leo instantly recoiled, dropping my hand and diving under the edge of the bed just as the tall shadow of a man passed by my door. It was Travis pacing the house in the middle of the night. I laid back down, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I knew right then and there that my son's dramatic bankruptcy was a calculated lie. I knew the heavy steel door at the end of the hall, the one Liam swore was just a broken utility closet, was hiding a terrible dark secret. And as I lay in the pitch-black room, the crushing guilt of losing my home melted away, replaced by a cold, searing rage. I was going to find out exactly what was behind that door, and I was going to protect my grandson no matter what it cost. Living in my son's house felt like suffocating slowly in a room made of glass. They called it downsizing, but the place was a sprawling, sterile fortress of polished quartz and sharp edges. Every step I took in my worn work boots seemed to echo like a gunshot, a constant reminder that I did not belong. Chloe made sure I felt it. My daughter-in-law moved through those pristine hallways, wrapped in silk robes, sipping imported mineral water, and looking at me as if I were a stray dog that had tracked mud onto her expensive rugs. She never said a harsh word directly to my face, but she didn't need to. Her eyes did all the talking. She would pointedly wipe down the counter after I made my instant coffee, or sigh loudly when I sat in the leather armchair. What gnawed at my gut, though, was the math that simply did not add up. Liam had sat at my table weeping about absolute financial ruin. Yet almost every single afternoon, delivery drivers dropped off packages from high-end boutiques. The kitchen was always fully stocked with premium cuts of meat and vintage wines. If they were on the brink of losing the shirts off their backs, nobody had bothered to tell Chloe. Then, there was her brother, Travis Jenkins. Travis was a man who wore expensive cologne like a weapon, and smiled with perfectly capped teeth that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He drove a sports car that roared in the driveway at all hours of the day and night. For a family allegedly drowning in catastrophic corporate debt, Travis seemed remarkably comfortable treating Liam's house like his personal country club. He and Liam would spend hours locked in hushed, tense conversations on the back patio. Whenever I walked outside to tend to the dying tomatoes in the garden, their voices would instantly drop to a dead whisper. Travis would flash me a fake patronizing grin, slap my shoulder, and ask how the retired life was treating me. My decades in the diesel shop taught me how to spot a faulty part by the sound it makes, and everything about Travis sounded entirely wrong. But all of that, the disdain, the suspicious wealth, the constant presence of a slick brother-in-law faded into the background whenever I looked at my grandson. Leo used to be a whirlwind of a boy. I remember him at 4 years old running through my backyard chasing lightning bugs and shouting my name until his lungs gave out. Now at 7, he was a ghost haunting his own home. 2 years ago, he simply stopped speaking. The silence fell over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Chloe and Liam carted him to an army of expensive pediatricians and behavioral specialists. The doctors slapped a label on it calling it selective mutism. They claimed it was a psychological phase, a trauma response triggered by the overwhelming stress of Liam's struggling business and the tension in the household. They said he would eventually grow out of it. But I spent 45 years diagnosing deep structural issues, and I knew a surface-level excuse when I heard one. I started watching Leo closely. He did not act like a child who was merely stressed by adult financial problems. He acted like a prisoner of war. If he was sitting on the living room floor coloring quietly, his entire posture would change the exact second the front door opened. If it was Liam returning from a supposed meeting with creditors, Leo would physically flinch. His small shoulders would instantly draw up toward his ears, his breathing would grow incredibly shallow, and he would slide himself behind the nearest piece of heavy furniture. It was even worse when Travis entered the room. Whenever that man's loud voice boomed down the hallway, Leo would squeeze his eyes shut and cover his ears with his small hands. I watched this happen time and time again, my heart twisting in my chest. A child does not cower in absolute terror because a logistics brokerage is failing. A child cowers because they are profoundly afraid of the people walking into the room. I tried to bridge the gap. I would sit on the floor with him, offering him my old wooden puzzles or a piece of butterscotch candy, but he would only stare at me with those wide, haunted eyes, pleading for a rescue he could not verbalize. The crushing weight of all these mysteries came to a devastating head on a rainy Thursday evening. We were gathered around the massive mahogany dining table. Chloe had ordered a lavish spread of sushi from a high-end restaurant downtown, pouring herself a generous glass of imported wine. I sat at the end of the table, pushing my food around my plate, feeling the oppressive silence thick in the air. Leo picked at his rice, his head bowed low. Liam cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his designer shirt. He did not look at me. He stared blankly at the wall just above my head. His voice was completely flat, stripped of the desperate weeping emotion he had used in my kitchen just 3 months prior. He announced that the money was gone. He said the $300,000 I had handed him, the very lifeblood of my home, and my late wife's memory had completely evaporated. He claimed the creditors were far more aggressive than he anticipated, and the capital was swallowed up by immediate penalties and corporate restructuring fees. I sat there, my lungs refusing to draw in air. I asked him what that meant for the business, for his family, and for the house I had mortgaged. Liam finally met my eyes, and I saw absolutely nothing in them. No remorse. No sorrow. Just a cold, empty void. He stated that the money was not enough to appease the lenders. They were officially filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy the very next morning. The brokerage was dead, the debts were insurmountable, and my sacrifice had been entirely useless. The bank was keeping my house, and there was nothing left to salvage. I had traded the only security I had left in this world for a lifeline that snapped the second I threw it. The morning sun had barely crested the manicured hedges of my son's neighborhood when the frantic energy in the house reached a boiling point. Liam, Chloe, and Travis were moving in a chaotic blur, grabbing leather briefcases and pulling on expensive coats. Today was the day they were supposedly marching into a downtown law firm to officially file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Yet, as I sat silently on a sleek modern stool at the edge of their massive marble kitchen island, I watched them with a heavy, sinking confusion. People who are about to lose everything they own do not move with a manic electric thrill. They do not pause by the hallway mirror to adjust a designer silk tie or casually check the reflection of their diamond earrings. When a man is truly broken by financial ruin, his shoulders slump and his eyes go hollow. I knew that feeling intimately because I was currently drowning in it. But Liam just grabbed his keys, shot a brief, hollow glance in my direction, and told me to keep an eye on the house. Within seconds, the front door slammed shut. The roaring engine of Travis's imported sports car echoed through the walls, quickly fading down the street until the house was swallowed by a deafening, absolute silence. I remained at the kitchen counter entirely paralyzed by a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my ribcage. The gravity of what happened yesterday hung over me like a dark storm cloud. The $300,000 I had handed my son was gone. The home Sarah and I had built, the very foundation of our entire life together, was officially lost to the bank. I looked down at my hands. They were scarred thick and permanently stained with the shadows of diesel grease from 45 years of back-breaking labor. Every busted knuckle and aching joint had been a willing sacrifice to ensure my family would never experience the cold, bitter bite of poverty. But a single signature on a mortgage document had erased 4 decades of sweat and love. I had traded Sarah's beautiful garden, our quiet front porch, and every irreplaceable memory we shared for a hollow promise. I felt like an absolute failure. I had failed my late wife, I had failed myself, and looking across the room I knew I was failing my grandson. Leo was sitting on the edge of the living room rug. He had a small wooden block in his hands, but he was not playing with it. He was just holding it perfectly still, his small body tightly coiled like a spring ready to snap. The immense guilt in my chest shifted into a deep, desperate ache to see the boy smile. I wanted to see a glimmer of the vibrant, energetic child he used to be before the silence took him. I pushed myself up from the kitchen stool, my old knees protesting the movement, and slowly walked over to the living room. I sat down heavily on the edge of the plush sofa, making sure to keep my distance so I would not startle him. I reached deep into the pocket of my worn flannel shirt. My fingers brushed against a small, crinkling piece of cellophane. I pulled out a round piece of butterscotch candy wrapped in bright yellow plastic. It was the exact kind Sarah used to buy by the bagful. She always kept a handful buried at the bottom of her purse, ready to reward Leo whenever he finished his vegetables or helped me sweep the garage. The soft crinkle of the wrapper sounded incredibly loud in the dead quiet of the living room. I held the sweet candy out toward him on the flat of my palm. I spoke in the softest, gentlest voice I could manage, telling him that his grandmother always said butterscotch was the perfect cure for a gloomy morning. I waited, hoping he would turn his head, hoping the familiar yellow wrapper would spark a happy memory and bring a tiny bit of warmth back into his haunted eyes. Leo did not reach for the candy. He did not even look at my hand. His pale face was turned completely away from me, angled toward the long, shadowy corridor that led to the garage entrance. I watched his breathing grow incredibly shallow. His chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven jerks. He dropped the wooden block onto the carpet. his small hands balled into tight fists, his knuckles turning completely white. The pure, unadulterated tension rolling off the boy was magnetic. I slowly lowered my hand, letting the butterscotch candy roll back into my palm. I turned my head to follow his intense, unblinking gaze. He was staring directly at the heavy door at the very end of the hallway. Liam had told me on my first day here that it was just a utility closet housing the main water heater and the HVAC system. He casually mentioned the internal locking mechanism was jammed and firmly warned me not to mess with it. As a tired, grieving father, I had accepted his explanation without a second thought. But sitting there in the profound silence, looking at the door through the terrified eyes of my grandson, my mechanical instincts finally woke up. I really looked at the door. It was not a standard hollow-core residential door. It was solid commercial-grade steel. The frame was reinforced flush against the drywall, with heavy-duty concealed hinges that you would normally find on a secure bank vault or a high-end commercial facility. And right above the silver handle, mounted directly into the thick steel, was a sophisticated digital keypad lock. Why would a simple broken utility closet require a commercial-grade steel door and an electronic security system? The air in the living room grew incredibly thick. The sterile hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen suddenly sounded like a roaring engine. I looked back at Leo. The boy was completely transfixed, paralyzed by a mixture of deep horror and desperate anticipation. He was not just looking at a locked door. He was looking at a cage. The agonizing mystery of his 2 years of silence, the strange manic energy of my son's morning departure, and the vanishing of my entire life savings all seemed to converge on that single piece of reinforced steel. My heart began to hammer, a heavy, relentless rhythm against my ribs as the oppressive silence of the house pressed in around us. I sat frozen on the edge of the sofa, the yellow-wrapped butterscotch candy still resting in my open palm. For what felt like an absolute eternity, the only sound in the sprawling living room was the steady rhythmic drumming of rain against the large bay windows. Then a subtle shift broke the heavy tension. Leo took a hesitant step away from the plush rug. His small socked feet made absolutely no noise on the polished hardwood, but his movements were incredibly deliberate. He crossed the vast, sterile space separating us. My chest tightened with a sudden, overwhelming surge of hope. I truly thought he was coming for the candy, perhaps finally allowing himself a tiny sliver of childhood joy. Instead, he completely ignored my outstretched hand. He reached right past it and grabbed my thick, calloused wrist. His grip was shockingly strong for a boy so thin. His fingers were ice-cold, trembling violently against my skin. He pulled himself incredibly close, pressing his fragile body against my knee. I leaned down, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I did not want to breathe too loudly and scare him away. He tilted his pale face upward, his haunted, wide eyes locked entirely onto mine. I saw rivers of unspoken terror swimming deep in his gaze. His jaw clenched, and his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The silence that had wrapped around this boy for 2 agonizing years shattered right then and there. His chest heaved with a massive, shuddering breath. When the words finally pushed past his lips, his voice was incredibly raspy, fragile, and raw from sheer disuse. It sounded like dry leaves rustling in a bitter winter wind. He whispered, "Check Dad's basement." The shock of hearing him speak hit me with the force of a swinging sledgehammer. The air rushed completely out of my lungs. I squeezed his freezing fingers back, my mind racing to comprehend what my grandson had just managed to utter. "Check Dad's basement." Those 3 words hung in the quiet room, heavy with a dark, terrifying weight. Why would a 7-year-old boy break a 2-year wall of absolute silence just to tell me to look inside a broken utility closet? I opened my mouth to ask him. I wanted to beg him to explain what he had seen, What terrible thing was hiding behind that commercial-grade steel door at the very end of the hallway? But before a single syllable could leave my throat, the sharp, aggressive crunch of tires violently tearing across the wet gravel outside severed the moment. The roaring, unmistakable growl of a high-performance engine echoed through the front yard. Leo reacted as if he had been physically struck. The tiny spark of bravery in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by an all-consuming blind panic. He ripped his hand away from mine. He scrambled backward, dropping to his hands and knees, and crawled frantically behind the heavy velvet drapes that framed the living room windows. He curled his small body into a tight ball, making himself completely invisible in the deep shadows. I forced myself to breathe. I had spent 45 years diagnosing catastrophic engine failures under immense pressure, keeping a cool head when thousands of pounds of machinery threatened to crash down around me. I channeled every single ounce of that disciplined restraint now. I purposely slumped my broad shoulders, rounding my back to look exactly like the defeated, bankrupt, and broken old man they all believed me to be. The front door burst open with a loud, aggressive thud. Travis stomped into the foyer, shaking the heavy rain from his expensive designer coat. He swore loudly, complaining to the empty house about the miserable weather and his own forgetfulness. The sharp scent of his overpowering cologne flooded the air. He marched down the corridor, his wet leather shoes squeaking sharply against the pristine floorboards. He barely even registered my presence as he stormed into the living room. I sat perfectly still on the sofa, staring blankly at the floor, letting the yellow piece of candy roll out of my palm and drop silently onto the rug. Travis grunted, stomping over to the glass coffee table where he had carelessly abandoned a sleek black leather briefcase earlier that morning. He snatched it up by the handle, muttering about how the high-priced lawyers were going to charge them by the minute for this ridiculous delay. I watched him entirely through my peripheral vision. He spun around to leave, but his frantic momentum suddenly hitched. Travis stopped dead in his tracks right in the middle of the hallway. He slowly turned his head, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto the heavy steel door at the far end of the corridor. The arrogant, slick demeanor he constantly wore completely melted away. For 10 long, agonizing seconds, he just stared at the digital keypad lock. His jaw muscle ticked furiously. It was not the look of a man annoyed by a broken water heater. It was the deeply paranoid, hyper-vigilant glare of a cornered predator ensuring its hidden kill was still safely buried. He took a single, hesitant step toward the steel door, as if he intended to test the handle, but a sudden loud crack of thunder rattled the windows, pulling him out of his trance. He shook his head, checked his gold wristwatch, and bolted for the front door. The heavy oak slammed shut behind him. The lock clicked firmly into place. The roar of his sports car faded away into the rainy morning. The silence rushed back in, but it was no longer empty. It was charged with a dangerous electric clarity. I looked over at the velvet drapes where my grandson was still hiding in absolute terror. Liam had lied to my face. My own flesh and blood had stolen the home my wife and I built, drained my life savings, and claimed total financial ruin, all while keeping a sinister, heavily guarded secret directly under our feet. I stood up from the sofa. My paralyzing grief was officially dead, burned away by a rising tide of fierce, protective fury. I was going to crack that steel door wide open, and God help anyone who stood in my way. The sharp echo of Travis's expensive sports car tearing down the wet street had barely faded into the rainy morning before my entire demeanor shifted. I was no longer the defeated, broken old man who had surrendered his life savings and swallowed his pride. I walked back over to the heavy velvet drapes where my grandson was still trembling in the deep shadows. I knelt down slowly, ignoring the sharp, grinding pain flaring in my arthritic knees, and placed a gentle, steady hand on his small shoulder. I did not ask him any questions about what he had seen. I did not demand to know why he had broken his 2-year silence. I just looked into his wide, terrified eyes and promised him that his grandfather was going to fix this. I told him to stay hidden, to keep completely quiet for just a little while longer. Leo nodded slowly, his small fingers clutching the thick fabric of the curtains like a lifeline. I stood up and made my way down the long, sprawling corridor. The air seemed to grow heavier, carrying a strange, unnatural chill with every step I took toward that solid steel door. Standing directly in front of it, the absolute absurdity of Liam's lie was glaringly obvious. No simple residential utility closet required a commercial-grade reinforced steel frame. And it certainly did not require the sophisticated high-security digital keypad mounted directly above the heavy silver handle. The device was sleek, featuring a complex numerical touchpad, a biometric thumb scanner, and a thick casing of hardened plastic. It was the exact type of expensive top-tier security hardware designed to keep corporate secrets completely locked away. It was an offensive, arrogant anomaly in the middle of a suburban family home. Liam probably thought that an aging mechanic like me would take one single look at a flashing digital screen and walk away intimidated. He assumed my entire world began and ended with heavy iron wrenches, thick black grease, and brute physical force. But my son had made a critical, arrogant miscalculation. He forgot that the heavy diesel industry had evolved dramatically over my 45-year career. I did not just turn heavy bolts on rusty engines. I spent decades diagnosing, dismantling, and flawlessly rebuilding the most complex electronic control modules and integrated security relays on massive industrial transport vehicles. I knew exactly how electrical currents flowed, how motherboards communicated, and how to meticulously manipulate closed circuits without ever triggering a systemic shutdown. I moved quickly toward the garage, where my old beat-up leather tool roll sat neglected in a cardboard box from the move. The familiar smell of motor oil and worn leather washed over me, grounding my racing thoughts. I untied the thick leather straps and selected my instruments with practiced, deliberate precision. I pulled out a micro screwdriver, set a digital multimeter, and a pair of fine, insulated wire strippers. My knuckles were swollen with decades of hard labor, and my lower back screamed in sharp protest as I hurried back inside, but my hands were entirely steady. The cold, righteous adrenaline pumping through my veins burned away the physical exhaustion of my age. I returned to the steel door and took a deep, steadying breath. The house was absolutely silent save for the relentless rhythmic drumming of the heavy rain beating against the vinyl siding. I carefully wedged the flathead micro screwdriver beneath the sleek plastic housing of the keypad. With a sharp, controlled twist of my wrist, the casing popped free, dangling quietly by a thin, fragile ribbon cable. Inside lay a dense, complicated nest of green, red, and yellow wires connected directly to a primary circuit board. This was where the true danger lay. I knew that tampering with the primary power source would instantly trigger a failsafe. It would likely drop the heavy deadbolts permanently into place and send a silent, immediate alarm straight to the local police dispatch or directly to Liam's smartphone. I had to locate the specific relay that controlled the magnetic locking mechanism and bypass it using a temporary secondary power loop. I turned on my multimeter, the tiny digital screen glowing brightly in the dark, shadowy hallway. I began testing the voltage on the exposed copper terminals, moving with agonizing, deliberate slowness. Every single sound in the empty house felt magnified by 1,000. Somewhere on the second floor, a settling wooden beam groaned loudly. The sudden sharp creak sounded exactly like a heavy footstep bearing down on the floorboards directly above my head. My heart vaulted into my throat, hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. I froze completely, the metal prongs of the multimeter hovering just a fraction of an inch away from a live electrical circuit. I held my breath, straining my ears, waiting in pure agony for the sound of a key turning in the front door, or Travis's cruel voice calling out from the top of the stairs. The seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. Only the steady, monotonous sound of the rain answered me. They were truly gone. I was still alone. I exhaled a long, shaky breath and wiped a bead of cold sweat from my brow. I went back to work, my focus narrowing entirely onto the glowing circuitry in front of me. I successfully isolated the green wire that fed to the magnetic lock. Carefully, meticulously, I used the wire strippers to peel back a tiny section of the rubber insulation, exposing the bright, shining copper strands underneath. I took a secondary jumper wire from my leather tool roll, attaching one end to the live battery terminal on the board, and carefully guiding the other end toward the exposed green wire. My thick, grease-stained fingers hovered over the connection. If I touched the wrong terminal, the entire system would lock down permanently, the alarm would trigger, and I would never discover what had terrified my grandson so profoundly. I thought about Leo hiding in the living room, robbed of his voice by fear. I thought about the $300,000 I had blindly sacrificed, losing the home Sarah and I had built, all to save a son who was actively, maliciously deceiving me. My jaw clenched tight. I banished the hesitation from my mind. I tapped the jumper wire against the exposed copper. A tiny blue spark jumped between the metals. For a terrifying, breathless second, absolutely nothing happened. Then a low, mechanical hum vibrated deep through the heavy steel door. The keypad flashed a solid, brilliant green. A soft electronic beep echoed through the silent hallway, followed instantly by the deep, heavy thud of the internal deadbolts retracting. The lock clicked open. I grabbed the silver handle, pulled downward, and the massive steel door slowly swung outward into the hallway, revealing a steep, dark set of wooden stairs descending into the unknown. A rush of cold, perfectly conditioned air hit my face the second I pulled the heavy steel door outward. It smelled nothing like a damp, forgotten basement or a dusty utility closet. It smelled like raw electricity and ozone. I reached for the light switch, my fingers brushing against a sleek panel on the wall. I flipped it. A row of brilliant, stark white LED tubes hummed to life across the ceiling, illuminating a space that defied every ounce of logic in my brain. My boots met the top of a reinforced metal staircase, and I walked down slowly, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. The space below was vast, stretching the entire length of the house. Liam had dug out the foundation, expanding it far beyond what any normal suburban blueprint would allow. Instead of a dusty water heater and discarded cardboard boxes, I was staring at a state-of-the-art climate-controlled server room. 4 massive floor-to-ceiling racks stood in the center of the concrete floor, packed tightly with blinking black hard drives. Thick bundles of Ethernet cables ran along the ceiling in perfect, meticulous alignment, feeding into heavy-duty industrial rotors. The low, relentless roar of high-end cooling fans filled the air, keeping the massive processing power at a steady, freezing temperature. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the setup. This was not the home of a broken man drowning in bankruptcy. This was a fortress. This was a command center. I moved deeper into the freezing room, my boots echoing sharply against the sealed concrete floor. Against the far wall sat a massive mahogany desk completely out of place among the blinking servers. Flanking that desk were 3 heavy fireproof commercial safes. 2 of them were locked tight, but the third was slightly ajar, as if someone had been rushing and carelessly failed to spin the heavy dial all the way. I approached it with a sickening feeling rising in my throat. I grabbed the cold metal handle and pulled it open. Inside, stacked with terrifying precision, were bricks of $100 bills. They were bound in tight rubber bands piled high like worthless bricks of clay. There had to be millions of dollars sitting right there in the dark. I reached out and brushed my rough fingers against the crisp paper, feeling a sudden violent wave of nausea wash over me. I had worn my hands down to the bone for 45 years just to put food on the table, and my son was hiding a mountain of cash in the dark. I thought about the absolute panic I felt when the bank manager handed me the foreclosure documents. I remembered the deeply humiliating process of selling off my prized diesel tools just to cover the moving truck. On the top of the desk lay a scatter of sleek silver thumb drives. I recognized them from my younger technicians at the shop. They were hardware crypto wallets, encrypted devices capable of holding untraceable digital fortunes. Beside them sat a series of thick black leather-bound ledgers. I opened the top ledger, my eyes scanning the meticulous columns of ink. My breathing turned incredibly shallow. Page after page detailed a sprawling, highly organized web of offshore shell corporations. The names were completely fabricated, registered in countries I had never even visited, but the accounting was flawless. Every single column represented massive wire transfers funneling money away from Liam's logistics brokerage and directly into these untraceable phantom companies. I flipped to the most recent pages, and that is when the true devastating horror of my son's actions finally snapped into perfect clarity. I saw the name Travis Jenkins printed boldly at the top of a distribution manifest. Travis was not just a lazy, freeloading brother-in-law. The documents clearly outlined his role as the primary manager of a massive, sophisticated money laundering syndicate. Travis was the architect of the shadow accounts, the man pulling the strings of a deeply corrupted network that spanned across multiple borders. He was using Liam's legitimate corporate facade to clean millions of dollars for unseen, dangerous clients. Liam's brokerage was nothing but a hollow front, a mechanism to wash dirty money and hide stolen assets. They were running an illegal empire right under the noses of everyone they knew. And then near the bottom of a page, dated exactly 3 months ago, I saw a familiar number. $300,000, the exact amount of the mortgage I took out on Sarah's house. Next to it was a note in Liam's unmistakable handwriting marking the funds as a clear, immediate transfer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The betrayal did not just break my heart. It hit me like a physical, crippling blow to the center of my chest. I staggered backward, my knees buckling until I hit the cold metal frame of a server rack. I gasped for air, clutching my shirt, as a blinding, furious agony tore through my soul. My own son did not fail in business. He had never faced a legitimate bankruptcy. Liam had looked me in the eye, wept crocodile tears at my kitchen table, and purposely bled me completely dry just to feed his criminal empire. He traded his mother's legacy for a stack of dirty bills. I stood alone in the freezing hum of the server room, completely shattered by the realization. The boy I had raised, the child I had protected from every hardship, had looked at my love as a weakness to be exploited. He let the bank take my home, allowed me to pack away 40 years of cherished memories in a few miserable cardboard boxes, and forced me to live like an unwanted guest in his house, all while sitting on an unimaginable mountain of stolen wealth. The sheer predatory malice of it was suffocating. I closed the leather ledger, my vision blurring with angry hot tears. The pieces of the puzzle were violently snapping together. The lavish lifestyle Chloe maintained, the fancy sports car Travis drove, the utter lack of panic in Liam's eyes when he talked about losing everything. It was all a meticulously crafted performance. And trapped right in the middle of this toxic, illegal nightmare was my sweet, innocent grandson, completely robbed of his voice by the horror of what he had likely witnessed. The overwhelming grief that had weighed me down all morning vanished completely, burning away, until absolutely nothing was left but a cold, indestructible resolve. I stood frozen over the heavy mahogany desk, the harsh hum of the cooling fans suddenly sounding like a deafening roar in my ears. My hands, thick and scarred from decades of wrenching on massive diesel rigs, trembled violently as I reached out to touch the stacks of paperwork carelessly scattered across the polished wood. Liam and Travis had been incredibly arrogant. They had assumed this subterranean fortress was entirely impenetrable, so they had carelessly left their blueprints of ruin sitting right out in the open. I pulled a thick, leather-bound folder toward me, my heart hammering a brutal, agonizing rhythm against my ribs. I opened the heavy cover, fully expecting to find more complex digital ledgers or confusing, convoluted financial jargon. Instead, I found a meticulously detailed step-by-step timeline of their absolute, unforgivable betrayal. The very first page was a highly confidential printed legal brief, clearly outlining the exact parameters of a massive Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing. But as my tired eyes rapidly scanned the brightly highlighted paragraphs and the sharp handwritten margin notes, the true depth of their horrible deception began to crystallize into a sickening, twisted reality. This was not a desperate last-minute measure taken by a legitimately failing business owner. The bankruptcy was a highly weaponized strategy. It was a perfectly calculated shield deliberately designed to completely wipe out all of their legitimate corporate debts while perfectly protecting the millions they had systematically siphoned into their various offshore accounts. I read through the thick stack of printed emails exchanged between Liam and a notoriously corrupt overseas attorney. They had spent the last 2 full years artificially inflating the massive operating costs of the logistics brokerage, slowly bleeding the company dry on official paper, while quietly funneling the actual massive profits directly into Travis's untraceable shadow corporations. They had successfully created a vast, intricate, and deeply convincing illusion of absolute poverty. The seemingly angry creditors, the terrifying and threatening phone calls, the pathetic, weeping breakdowns at my quiet kitchen table. It was all a meticulously choreographed, disgusting performance. Liam had intentionally orchestrated his own financial collapse just to legally and permanently erase his massive financial obligations. He was effectively using the federal bankruptcy courts to wash his dirty hands completely clean, willingly, leaving a massive destructive trail of unpaid vendors and entirely ruined contractors in his wake. And worst of all, he had weaponized my absolute unconditional fatherly love for him as the ultimate disposable pawn in his deeply twisted financial game. I flipped to the next section of the thick folder, my vision actively swimming with hot, furious tears that I refused to let fall. Tucked neatly behind a heavy plastic divider were glossy, expensive real estate brochures and officially printed flight itineraries. They were not planning to stay and slowly rebuild their lives after the complicated bankruptcy dust finally settled. I stared in utter disgust at the high-resolution photos of a sprawling multi-million-dollar coastal villa securely located in a remote tropical jurisdiction that deliberately did not possess an active extradition treaty with the United States government. They had already paid a massive untraceable cash deposit on the luxurious property. The private flight tickets were officially booked for late next month, completely one-way scheduled under a matching set of newly acquired foreign passports. They were going to simply let the domestic legal system completely implode around them, allow the aggressive banks to pick the rotting bones of the fake brokerage entirely clean, and then they were going to effortlessly vanish. They would board a private, extremely luxurious charter flight, leaving behind the smoking wreckage of the innocent lives they had intentionally destroyed, and confidently live like absolute kings on a sunny foreign beach entirely paid for with our stolen money. The heavy paper slipped from my weakened grasp, fluttering silently to the cold concrete floor. The freezing air in the quiet server room suddenly felt like sharp ice plunging directly into my lungs. The entire layer of conflict shifted violently in my mind, rapidly mutating from simple greedy financial theft into a sickening, pure and calculating malice. Liam had not come to me in a genuine moment of desperate, weeping panic. He had purposely come to me because my beautiful, fully paid-off home was the final easiest target left on his predatory list. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I would never turn my back on my family. He knew I would eagerly sign away 45 years of back-breaking, exhausting labor just to save his skin. He intentionally bled me completely dry, knowing full well that he was going to let the bank aggressively foreclose on Sarah's cherished garden and our quiet, peaceful front porch. He stood by and watched me pack my most precious memories into miserable, damp cardboard boxes, knowing he had hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars sitting right here in this freezing basement. He actively planned to leave me rotting away in a state-run, substandard nursing facility while he confidently sipped expensive cocktails on a distant foreign beach. The sheer predatory cruelty of his master plan tore brutally through my soul, permanently eradicating the very last shred of fatherly devotion I held for him. I was no longer a grieving, broken father begging for scraps of affection. I was a man who had been pushed past the absolute brink, and I was going to tear their entire criminal empire down to the ground. I promised myself right then and there that they would clearly feel the crushing, inescapable weight of real justice. I would methodically and completely destroy every single lie they had built successfully, ensuring they legally lost absolutely everything they held dear forever. I turned away from the heavy leather ledgers. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as the freezing air of the climate-controlled server room chilled the sweat on my neck. The sheer scale of the financial theft was staggering. It was enough to ruin any man. But a soft, glowing hum from the far corner of the massive mahogany desk suddenly caught my attention. A secondary computer monitor sat there. Its screen had gone dark on standby mode. I reached out, my thick fingers gently brushing the computer mouse. The screen immediately flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across the solid concrete walls. Liam had been so incredibly arrogant, so entirely convinced of his own untouchable brilliance, that he had not even bothered to lock the computer workstation. I navigated through the open windows, desperate to find anything else that might secure his ultimate downfall. That is when I noticed a minimized folder sitting plainly on the digital desktop. It was simply labeled with the word Archive. I clicked it open. Inside lay dozens of subfolders containing localized security footage. They were meticulously dated and categorized by camera angles covering the entire property. My eyes tracked down the long list until they stopped dead on a specific sequence of video files. The dates corresponded exactly to the early spring of 2 years ago. That was the precise timeline when my bright, energetic, and happy grandson suddenly lost his voice forever. My hand shook violently as I double-clicked the first video file in that sequence. The media player popped open on the screen, revealing the grainy black and white security feed of this very basement. The digital timestamp in the corner read 2 in the morning. For a few tense seconds, the room on the monitor was completely empty. Then the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs slowly creaked open. A tiny, fragile figure wearing dinosaur pajamas padded hesitantly down the wooden steps. It was Leo. He was only 5 years old back then. He was clutching a small stuffed bear to his chest, clearly looking for his parents after waking up from a bad dream. He wandered into the center of the dark server room. his little face illuminated by the blinking lights of the massive hard drives. He looked utterly confused by the loud industrial cooling fans. He called out for his father. The innocent, sweet sound of his voice coming through the computer speakers nearly tore my heart cleanly in half. He had not made a sound like that in 2 entire years. Suddenly, the steel door at the top of the stairs flew open again. Liam and Chloe stormed down the steps, their faces twisted in absolute panicked fury. They had realized the secure basement was breached. I watched my own son march aggressively across the concrete floor, snatching his 5-year-old child by the upper arm and violently jerking him around. Leo dropped his stuffed bear, crying out in sudden shock. Chloe slammed the basement door shut, rushing over and kneeling directly in front of the terrified boy. What unfolded next was a display of psychological torture, so monstrous, so deeply depraved, that my blood turned to solid ice. They did not strike him physically. They did something infinitely worse to his young mind. Liam leaned down, getting right into his own son's face, his voice an aggressive, venomous hiss. He pointed to the blinking servers and told Leo that those machines belonged to very bad, very dangerous men. He told his own child that if he ever spoke a single word about this secret room to anyone, those monsters would come to their house in the middle of the night. Liam swore to the sobbing boy that the bad men would drag him away in a heavy black bag, and he would never see the son, his toys, or his parents ever again. Chloe chimed in, reinforcing the horrific, twisted nightmare. She grabbed Leo by the shoulders, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into his small, trembling frame. She told him the only way to stay safe, the only way to keep the monsters away, was to never speak again. She hissed that every single word he uttered from that night forward would act like a beacon, drawing the dangerous men straight to his bedroom window. They stood over him, 2 towering figures of absolute authority, completely dismantling a 5-year-old boy's fundamental sense of safety and reality. They broke his delicate spirit with surgical, calculated precision. I watched Leo collapse onto the cold concrete floor, sobbing silently. He covered his mouth with both of his tiny hands, as the sheer, suffocating terror permanently rewired his developing brain. His mind chose absolute mutism as a desperate, tragic defense mechanism against the unimaginable nightmare his own parents had constructed just to protect their dirty money. The video feed ended, leaving me staring at my own pale, horrified reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. The man looking back at me was forever changed. The lingering sorrow over my stolen retirement funds completely evaporated. The betrayal of the mortgage money was absolutely nothing compared to this horrific revelation. My son had systematically tortured his own child just to protect his illicit cash flow. He had willingly sacrificed Leo's beautiful voice, his innocent happiness, and his entire childhood on the altar of pure, disgusting greed. Liam was not just a white-collar criminal or a deceitful businessman. He was a ruthless monster, wearing the familiar skin of the boy I had raised. I did not scream out in agony. I did not drop to my knees and break down into helpless, broken tears. That kind of grief belonged to a loving grandfather, and the grandfather inside me had just died on that cold basement floor. What remained was a freezing, absolute resolve that settled deep into my aging bones. I was going to tear their entire world apart piece by piece. I was going to systematically destroy them and ensure they paid for every single second of silence they forced upon my grandson. The immediate urge to grab a heavy steel wrench and smash every single blinking machine in that freezing room was nearly blinding. My fists were clenched so tightly that my fingernails bit deeply into my calloused palms, drawing tiny drops of hot blood. I wanted to march upstairs, wait for Liam to walk through the front door, and beat the absolute truth out of him. I wanted to grab him by the collar of his expensive designer shirt and demand to know how he could destroy his own innocent son. But blind anger is a foolish young man's game. A physical brawl always favors youth and brute strength. I was nearly 70 years old with bad knees, a damaged lower back, and a heart that had already taken too much damage. If I confronted them now, they would simply overpower me. They would destroy the hard drives, burn the ledgers, and find a dark, permanent way to silence me, just like they silenced my sweet grandson. An intellectual war, however, favors the experienced. It favors the patient and the methodical. I forced myself to take a long, deep breath, letting the freezing artificial air of the server room completely cool the burning fury trapped in my chest. I had spent my entire adult life taking apart massive, complex machines to find the single broken component that was causing the failure. Now, I was going to dismantle my son's sprawling criminal life with that exact same surgical precision. I moved back to the massive mahogany desk with complete mechanical focus. From my worn leather tool roll, I retrieved a high-capacity portable hard drive I originally bought for storing heavy-engine diagnostic software. I plugged the black cable directly into the open port on the main computer terminal. The bright screen immediately prompted a data transfer window. I initiated a full mirror clone of the archive folder, the horrifying security footage, and every single digital financial ledger I could locate on the desktop, while the blue progress bar slowly and agonizingly crawled across the monitor. I turned my undivided attention to the physical proof scattered across the desk. I pulled a small digital camera from my front pocket. It was a sturdy older model I used exclusively to document complex engine damage for commercial insurance claims, but it took incredibly sharp and clear pictures. I opened the thick leather-bound books one by one. The camera shutter clicked softly in the cold, silent air as I photographed every single page. I captured the offshore account numbers, the fake shell corporation names, and the highly detailed money laundering manifests. I made absolutely sure the overhead lighting caught the exact ink signatures proving Liam and Travis were the sole architects of this massive global fraud. Next, I moved over to the heavy fireproof safe. I pulled out several thick bundles of the crisp $100 bills. I arranged them neatly on the smooth wood of the desk and photographed the serial numbers wrapping the camera strap tightly around my wrist to keep my hands perfectly steady. I captured the official bank stamps on the currency bands proving these were the exact funds illegally diverted from the Bankrupt brokerage. I worked with the cold, calculated efficiency of a man dismantling a ticking bomb. Every snap of the camera lens was a heavy iron nail in their eventual coffin. The digital transfer finally pinged its quiet completion. I safely ejected my portable drive and buried it deep inside the hidden zipped lining of my tool roll. I then went back into the computer system and meticulously cleared the recent access history. I wiped the temporary cache completely clean and reset the standby timer to ensure no one could ever tell the machine had been awakened. I placed the heavy leather ledgers back on the desk exactly as I had found them, perfectly aligning the worn corners with the sharp edge of the wood. I stacked the banded cash back into the safe and pushed the heavy steel door shut, making sure the locking bolts engaged with a solid, satisfying thud. I grabbed my tools, turned off the stark white lights, and walked back up the steep wooden stairs. I reconnected the keypad housing in the hallway, carefully placing the plastic cover back over the exposed wires and wiping away any trace of my fingerprints. I heard the magnetic lock engage, sealing the nightmare away. I had barely zipped my tool bag closed and hidden it under my guest room bed when the distinct rumble of an engine echoed into the driveway. The heavy garage door rattled open, Liam and Chloe were home. An hour later, I was sitting at the formal dining room table, staring down at a plate of expensive roasted salmon and imported vegetables. My stomach churned with a violent, sickening disgust. Chloe was pouring herself a tall glass of sparkling water, chatting animatedly about a luxury vacation she wanted to take once the legal stress of the fake bankruptcy was finally over. Liam sat at the head of the table, sipping a dark red wine, looking completely relaxed and victorious. He casually asked me how my day was playing the role of the concerned, loving son with sickening perfection. I looked at the man who shared my blood, the man who had stolen my home and psychologically tortured his own child. Leo sat quietly beside me, picking at his food, with his head bowed, completely paralyzed by the presence of his abusers. The psychological tension required to keep my face completely blank was absolute agony. Every muscle in my jaw screamed with the monumental effort to remain silent. I forced my broad shoulders to slump forward in defeat. I kept my tired eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood table. I picked up my silver fork with a deliberately trembling hand and told him my day was just fine, acting exactly like the broken, helpless old man they completely believed me to be. I chewed the fancy food that tasted like pure, dry ash in my mouth, swallowing my pride along with it. They smiled warmly at each other, thinking they had won the ultimate prize. They truly thought they had outsmarted the entire world. But tucked safely away in my dark room was the digital key to their total annihilation. I just had to survive this dinner and let them continue digging their own shallow graves. The following morning broke with a painfully cheerful burst of bright sunshine that felt completely at odds with the toxic, suffocating rot festering inside my son's house. I sat quietly at the massive marble breakfast island, methodically stirring a cup of black coffee, while Liam and Chloe bustled around the kitchen. They were still riding the arrogant high of their perceived victory, casually discussing high-end imported tile options for a future renovation they supposedly could not afford. When Liam paused to ask what I had planned for the day, I gave him a weak, thoroughly convincing smile. I told him in a soft, trembling voice that I was heading over to the local community center for a church-sponsored grief support group. I played the part of the lonely, devastated widower seeking desperate emotional solace perfectly. Liam offered a quick, condescending nod of approval, clearly thrilled to have the depressing, useless old man out of his pristine house for a few hours. I grabbed my worn flannel jacket and my heavy beat-up leather satchel, the one currently concealing the digital hard drive and my camera, and walked out the front door. The very second I slid into the driver's seat of my rusted pickup truck and pulled away from their manicured curb, my pathetic facade completely dropped. My calloused hands gripped the steering wheel with absolute freezing, unyielding purpose. I pointed my truck north, driving far away from the wealthy suburban sprawl and heading directly toward the rugged, heavily wooded outskirts of the county. I was not going to a damp church basement to cry in a circle of folding chairs. I was going to see an old friend. His name was Martin Vance. 20 years ago, Martin was a junior federal forensic accountant going through an incredibly brutal, financially ruinous divorce. He had lost almost everything he owned and was living out of a battered, highly unreliable rig that kept breaking down on the side of the highway. I owned my diesel shop back then, and I knew a good, honest man when I saw one down on his luck. For nearly a full year, I serviced his truck completely free of charge. I rebuilt his shattered transmission, replaced his failing alternator, and kept him safely on the road so he could get to work and fight for legal custody of his children. I never asked for a single dime, and I never expected a favor in return. But Martin was a man who deeply valued loyalty and integrity. He had eventually climbed the aggressive ranks to become one of the most feared, relentless and respected financial investigators in the federal government before taking an early retirement. If anyone alive could navigate the dark labyrinth of offshore shell corporations and untraceable cryptocurrency wallets, it was him. The dirt road leading up to Martin's secluded custom-built cabin was rough, but my old truck handled the deep, muddy ruts with practiced ease. I parked near his wide front porch where the crisp, pine-scented air immediately filled my burning lungs. Martin was already waiting for me by the heavy oak door, holding 2 steaming mugs of dark roast coffee. He had aged significantly, his thick hair completely silver now, but his sharp, deeply analytical eyes had not lost a single ounce of their piercing, intelligent intensity. We exchanged a firm, silent, and understanding handshake. There was absolutely no need for empty small talk. He could see the heavy, dark burden resting squarely on my shoulders. He led me straight past his cozy living room and directly into his home office. It was a highly secure, heavily reinforced room, packed with top-tier computer mainframes and towering fireproof filing cabinets. I sat down heavily in the leather chair opposite his desk, unzipped my satchel, and pulled out the portable hard drive. I placed it gently onto the center of his desk, right alongside the thick stack of high-resolution photographs I had printed out at a local pharmacy earlier that morning. I looked him straight in the eye and told him that my son and my son-in-law were running a massive illegal money laundering syndicate, and I needed his professional help to completely and utterly destroy them. Martin did not flinch. He did not offer empty, sympathetic platitudes or waste precious time expressing his personal disbelief. He simply gave a single solemn nod, put on his reading glasses, and plugged the hard drive into his primary secure terminal. For the next 3 hours, the only sounds in that secluded, quiet office were the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard and the heavy, incredulous sighs escaping his lungs as he expertly navigated through the cloned archive folders. I watched his face shift from professional curiosity to absolute stony shock. He meticulously scrutinized the photographs of the banded $100 bills, perfectly matching the visible serial numbers against the digital ledgers. He expertly traced the complex, winding web of fake international corporations following the digital breadcrumbs Travis had arrogantly and carelessly left behind. When he finally leaned back in his leather chair, he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with a potent mixture of profound professional respect and deep, empathetic sorrow. He confirmed my absolute worst fears. The fraud was not just a small, localized tax scam. It was a sprawling, highly organized, multi-million-dollar operation. They were aggressively washing illicit funds for highly dangerous people, utilizing the fake corporate bankruptcy to permanently sever any legal ties to their stolen wealth. He even found the exact routed wire transfer that swallowed my $300,000 mortgage payment. We sat there in the quiet, steady hum of his server room and began to methodically build a cage. A physical, violent confrontation would have been entirely useless, a brief, satisfying moment of blind anger that would ultimately allow them to legally slip away. Instead, we were going to flawlessly engineer an inescapable legal trap. Martin explained that we could not simply hand this mountain of evidence over to the local police department. Liam and Travis had too much stolen money, and likely too many expensive connected lawyers ready to bury a local investigation in endless bureaucratic delays. We needed to go much higher. Martin reached for his secure, encrypted phone, explaining that he still maintained direct, highly confidential lines to his former colleagues at the highest federal levels. We spent the remainder of the afternoon drafting a comprehensive, airtight dossier. We mapped out every single hidden offshore account, every fraudulent bank transfer, and the exact geographical coordinates of their tropical safe haven. We were meticulously weaving a suffocating net of federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and massive grand larceny charges. There would be absolutely no legal loopholes. There would be no favorable plea deals. I provided him with every single detail of their upcoming private flight escape plan, perfectly ensuring the authorities would strike at the exact devastating moment when Liam and Travis felt the most invincible. As we finalized the strategy, the crushing weight of betrayal in my chest began to fully transform into a cold, deeply satisfying anticipation. My son thought he had buried a foolish old man alive, but he had merely handed a seasoned mechanic the exact tools needed to dismantle his entire world. The suffocating pressure inside the sprawling house thickened into a physical weight against my throat. I had returned from Martin's cabin and seamlessly slipped back into my pathetic disguise, wearing the mask of a broken grandfather. Beneath that facade, my mind ran a high-speed diagnostic on every movement my son made. I was a coiled spring, gathering tension, waiting for the federal trap to snap shut. Dealing with cornered, desperate predators is highly volatile, and I was about to learn how rapidly a tightly controlled environment could violently combust. It started on a gloomy Tuesday afternoon. I sat at the edge of the kitchen island, quietly attempting to coax Leo into eating a small bowl of applesauce. The boy was completely unresponsive, staring blankly at the marble countertop, his tiny shoulders hunched forward defensively. Chloe marched into the quiet room, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply. She carried a sleek tablet, scrolling furiously, her perfectly manicured face twisted into a mask of utter contempt. She did not even bother to lower her voice or acknowledge my presence. She tossed her tablet onto the counter and loudly complained to Liam, who had just stepped out of his office. She aggressively declared that she was entirely sick of tripping over the old man and dealing with a creepy defective child. Her words dripped with a toxic venom that made the hairs on my arms stand up. She called me a lingering burden, complaining that the house constantly smelled like cheap flannel and stale disappointment. Then she turned her cruel gaze directly toward my grandson. She hissed that having a mute kid sneaking around the hallways completely ruined her peace. She demanded to know when they were finally taking out the trash. Liam did not defend his son. He simply wrapped an arm around her waist and promised her that the final phase was already in motion. He told her to pack her bags for the tropics and leave the heavy lifting to him and Travis. I kept my head bowed, my calloused hands gripping the edge of the stool so tightly my knuckles turned white. I gently rubbed Leo's back silently, promising the terrified boy that these monsters would never touch him again. The horrifying depth of their final phase revealed itself later that evening. The heavy rain returned, beating relentlessly against the windows. I retreated to my guest bedroom, leaving the door cracked to monitor the hallway. Around midnight, the distinct roar of Travis's car cut through the storm. I heard the front door open and the heavy thud of his boots crossing the foyer. He headed straight for Liam's study. I slipped out of bed, my socks making absolutely no sound. I crept down the dark corridor, pressing my back flat against the drywall, just outside the slightly open door. The sharp clink of crystal glasses echoed from inside. Travis spoke in a rushed, highly agitated tone. He told Liam that their overseas contact flagged a sudden inquiry from a federal regulator regarding one of their primary shell corporations. Their meticulously planned timeline was collapsing. Travis aggressively insisted that they accelerate their departure. They needed to execute the final wire transfers within the next 48 hours and immediately board the private flight before authorities could freeze their assets. Liam's voice was remarkably calm, layered with an icy detachment that made my stomach violently churn. He agreed to the accelerated timeline, stating that the untraceable funds were safely parked in the Cayman accounts. But then Travis asked the question that made my blood run completely cold. He asked what they were going to do with the dead weight. He explicitly named me and Leo. My son did not hesitate. He laid out a blueprint of absolute unforgivable cruelty. He casually explained he had signed the paperwork to commit me to a massive underfunded state-run nursing facility. He referred to it as a miserable, heavily sedated environment where a bankrupt old man could rave about stolen mortgage money all day and absolutely no one would ever listen. He had scheduled the transport van to arrive first thing Friday morning to forcibly haul me away. His plan for his own flesh and blood, his tiny traumatized son, was infinitely worse. Liam coldly stated that Leo was a severe liability. The boy had seen the basement, witnessed their aggressive intimidation, and his continued presence was a dangerous loose end. Liam told Travis he had enrolled Leo in a highly specialized lockdown behavioral boarding school located in a remote mountain region. It was a notoriously brutal facility designed to warehouse extremely troubled youth operating entirely outside standard child protective services. Liam bragged that once he dropped the boy off and signed over temporary guardianship to the administrative staff, Leo would be effectively buried alive. He would be locked away in an isolated institution, unable to communicate, stripped of his identity, and discarded so his father could enjoy his millions in absolute peace. I stood frozen in the dark hallway, the terrifying reality of their conversation crashing down upon me like a collapsing concrete wall. They were actively preparing to erase us from the face of the earth. They were going to throw me into a chemical prison and ship an innocent, traumatized child into a living nightmare just to cover their tracks. The conflict escalated far beyond financial ruin and legal revenge. We were out of time. The federal net Martin and I were carefully weaving would take at least another week to secure the necessary warrants. By then I would be locked in a psychiatric ward, and my grandson would be lost in a remote nightmare. I realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the danger was no longer a distant threat. It was an immediate physical crisis. I could no longer wait for the slow wheels of the justice system to turn. I had to get my grandson out of this house tonight before it was too late to save us. The rain from the previous night had finally stopped by dawn, leaving a heavy, humid fog hanging low over the manicured lawns of the upscale neighborhood. I did not sleep a single wink. My mind had become a cold, calculating steel trap, mapping out every necessary move to get my grandson out of that house before Liam and Travis could execute their monstrous plan. I knew that blind panic was the absolute enemy of survival. I needed to construct an exit so perfectly mundane, so utterly pathetic, that their arrogant criminal minds would never suspect a thing. I waited in the sprawling kitchen, brewing a pot of strong black coffee, listening closely to the heavy, oppressive silence of the house. When Liam finally walked downstairs, dressed in his crisp, custom-tailored designer suit, I was entirely ready. I forced the rigid tension completely out of my shoulders, letting my posture sag into the familiar defeated shape of a broken old man. I poured a steaming mug of coffee and pushed it slowly across the polished marble island toward him. I kept my voice incredibly soft, purposely injecting just the right amount of weary submission into my tone. I told him that an old buddy from my diesel mechanics union, a retired foreman named Charlie, had just bought a small, quiet cabin up by the lake. I explained that Charlie had called early this morning and offered to take me and little Leo on a weekend fishing trip. I deliberately looked down at my worn leather boots, muttering that I knew the boy, and I had been a massive lingering burden on him and Chloe lately. I said that a few days out in the fresh country air would give everyone in the house some much-needed peace and quiet. I watched his face carefully, my heart pounding a steady hidden rhythm. The transformation was sickeningly instantaneous. A bright spark of pure, unadulterated relief flashed violently across his cold, calculating eyes. He was desperate for an empty house. He needed the space cleared to safely move his illegal servers, dismantle the basement, and transfer the stolen millions before their private flight out of the country. Having the useless old man and the mute kid conveniently disappear for the entire weekend was a stroke of absolute luck for his highly accelerated criminal timeline. Liam immediately seized the golden opportunity. He put on his best, most sickeningly patronizing smile. He reached across the expensive counter and squeezed my shoulder, telling me that a fishing trip sounded like a fantastic idea for both of us. He even had the sheer unbelievable audacity to pull out a crisp $50 bill from his leather wallet, sliding it across the marble to buy some extra bait. I stared at the green paper, deeply aware that it was a tiny, insulting fraction of the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had ruthlessly stolen from my life savings. I swallowed the burning bile rising rapidly in my throat, nodded meekly, and tucked the cash deep into my flannel pocket. I thanked him with a weak, hollow whisper, walked out of the kitchen, and headed straight for Leo's bedroom. The boy was sitting perfectly still on the edge of his bed, hugging his torn, stuffed bear tightly against his chest. He looked up at me with those wide, haunted eyes. I knelt down to his eye level, moving with slow, deliberate care. I spoke in a gentle, reassuring whisper, promising him that we were leaving this dark place and going somewhere completely safe. I packed a small canvas duffel bag with his warmest sweaters, his favorite picture books, and every single thing that brought him any trace of comfort. I then walked into my own guest room, grabbing my heavy, grease-stained satchel. It contained the cloned digital hard drive, the high-resolution photographs, and the absolute destruction of my son's empire. That was the only baggage that truly mattered now. We walked back down the grand wooden staircase together. Liam and Chloe were already waiting by the front door. Chloe was barely masking her profound delight. She was tapping furiously on her phone, undoubtedly coordinating the immediate arrival of their shadow-moving crew. Liam stepped forward and pulled me into a tight, incredibly fake embrace. He patted my back with aggressive affection, telling me to drive safely and enjoy the quiet time with my grandson. The sheer physical effort required to stand there and accept a hug from the man who intended to lock me in a chemical prison was astronomical. My skin crawled with absolute revulsion, but I returned the gesture with a hollow, deceitful pat of my own. I guided Leo out the front door, down the wide concrete steps, and directly into the passenger seat of my rusted pickup truck. I buckled him in tight, making sure the heavy seatbelt safely secured his fragile frame. I walked around to the driver's side, climbed behind the wheel, and fired up the old diesel engine. The familiar deep rumble vibrated through the metal chassis, a comforting, honest roar against the deafening, toxic silence of the boy sitting beside me. I shifted the truck into gear and pulled away from the curb without looking back. As we rolled down the immaculate tree-lined street, I looked up into the rearview mirror. I watched Liam's sprawling, fraudulent mansion grow smaller and smaller until it completely disappeared around the bend. A profound sense of liberation washed over me, replacing the suffocating grief that had plagued me for months. I was driving away from the wreckage of my past, fully aware that I would never return to that house as a victim ever again. The illusion of my family was dead, but my purpose had never been clearer. The next time I saw my son, the mask of the broken old man would be gone. I would be bringing the full, crushing weight of absolute justice directly to his front door, and I was going to watch his entire criminal world burn to the ground. The rain had finally washed away the oppressive humidity by the time we reached the outskirts of the city. I did not take my grandson to a quiet lake or a rustic fishing cabin. Instead, I drove straight to an upscale, highly secure hotel located on the far north side of town. I had already made a discreet phone call to Eleanor, a retired pediatric nurse, and the widow of my oldest union buddy. Eleanor was a tough, fiercely loyal woman who loved Leo like her own flesh and blood. She was already waiting for us in the lobby, holding a small bag of groceries and a warm, reassuring smile. We escorted Leo up to a private top-floor suite that I had booked under a completely different name, using the last bit of cash I had hidden away. The room was spacious, filled with soft light, and far removed from the suffocating terror of his father's house. I knelt down on the plush carpet, taking his small, fragile hands in mine. I looked deeply into his wide eyes and promised him that he was entirely safe now. I told him Eleanor was going to watch over him. They were going to watch cartoons, eat junk food, and wait for me to finish a very important job. Leo gave me a tiny, brave nod. He reached out and wrapped his thin arms around my neck, holding on for a brief, incredibly precious second. That embrace was the absolute final armor I needed. Leaving him in Eleanor's capable hands, I walked out of that hotel suite with a heart made of solid iron. Martin was waiting for me outside in his unmarked sedan. We did not waste time with pleasantries. I climbed into the passenger seat, my heavy leather satchel resting squarely on my knees. We drove in tense, determined silence toward the downtown financial district. Our destination was not a local police precinct. We were heading directly to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The towering structure of glass and steel loomed ahead of us, a massive monument to federal authority. It was a place designed to intimidate, but I felt absolutely no fear. I had spent 45 years turning wrenches, busting my knuckles on heavy machinery, and sweating in diesel shops. I was a simple working-class grandfather, but today I carried the destructive power to completely dismantle a multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate. We parked in the underground garage and took the secure elevator up to the main reception area. Martin flashed his retired credentials, and within minutes we were escorted down a long, sterile corridor. We were led into a stark, windowless conference room where two senior FBI agents were already waiting. Standing beside them was a tall, sharply dressed man named Arthur Vance, the legally appointed federal bankruptcy trustee currently overseeing Liam's fraudulent Chapter 7 filing. The atmosphere in the room was highly skeptical at first. These were seasoned professionals, men and women who dealt with complex corporate crimes every single day. They looked at my worn flannel shirt and my grease-stained hands with a mixture of polite dismissal and mild impatience. Trustee Vance cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, and began to explain that interfering with an active federal bankruptcy case was a serious offense. I did not say a word. I simply unzipped my heavy leather satchel and began pulling out the physical blueprint of my son's total annihilation. I placed the thick stacks of high-resolution photographs directly onto the center of the large mahogany table. I laid out the crystal-clear images of the banded $100 bills, the offshore bank stamps, and the detailed corporate ledgers. Then I placed the cloned digital hard drive right beside them. Martin stepped forward seamlessly, shifting into his former role as a master forensic accountant. He booted up a secure laptop they provided and plugged the drive in, projecting the stolen financial records onto the large screen at the front of the room. I watched the collective demeanor of the federal agents change in a single electrifying heartbeat. The polite skepticism instantly vanished, replaced by an absolute silence. Trustee Vance leaned so far forward over the table that he nearly knocked over his coffee mug. His eyes darted frantically across the projected spreadsheets, tracing the massive illicit wire transfers moving from Liam's bankrupt brokerage directly into Travis' untraceable shadow corporations. The lead FBI agent, a stern woman with a sharp gaze, picked up the photographs of the cash bundles. She meticulously compared the serial numbers against a digital database on her tablet. The sheer scale of the meticulously documented evidence was staggering. They were looking at a perfectly preserved, entirely unarguable record of a global money laundering operation. I had not just brought them a suspicion or a wild conspiracy theory. I had handed them a fully solved case wrapped in undeniable concrete proof. I had done the agonizingly complex diagnostic work for them. Martin pointed to the flight itineraries and the offshore property deeds explaining the highly accelerated timeline. He explicitly detailed how they planned to intentionally default on massive corporate loans, completely bypass federal tax laws, and disappear into a non-extradition paradise. The agents began speaking rapidly, firing off legal codes and outlining immediate tactical maneuvers. They immediately recognized the undeniable elements of federal wire fraud, malicious bankruptcy fraud, and astronomical tax evasion. The trap I had so carefully constructed was officially snapping shut. The experienced federal agents did not hesitate for another single second. They aggressively mobilized their specialized task force, coordinating rapid asset freezes and drafting emergency federal warrants. Sitting in that secure room, watching the immense power of the national justice system align with my burning fury, I felt a profound sense of righteous satisfaction. My son thought he could discard his flesh and blood to fund a tropical escape. Instead, his monumental arrogance had just triggered an unstoppable avalanche of absolute ruin. The atmosphere in the room shifted from triumphant energy to a tense and calculated reality. The lead investigator, a woman named Agent Miller, who possessed a stare sharp enough to cut diamond, leaned across the heavy mahogany table. She tapped a pen against the printed offshore ledgers I had brought. She explained that while the evidence against my son was absolutely ironclad for the bankruptcy fraud and embezzlement, the broader syndicate was a different beast entirely. Travis and Chloe were incredibly careful. They had intentionally insulated themselves behind layers of proxy signatures and foreign privacy laws. On paper, they looked like innocent bystanders. Agent Miller made it brutally clear that if they just arrested Liam today, Travis would immediately scrub the accounts, destroy the physical server room, and vanish into the wind with Chloe. We had the blueprint, but to put all of them away for decades, the federal government needed to catch them actively moving the illicit funds in real time. Trustee Vance chimed in, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He stated that financial criminals of this magnitude only make fatal errors when they are forced out of their comfort zones. They needed to believe their perfectly constructed house of cards was actively collapsing. They needed a catalyst, something incredibly volatile, to trigger a blind and reckless panic. If they felt the federal net closing in, they would inevitably rush to manually authorize the final offshore transfers and scramble for the airport. That desperate, uncoordinated dash would provide the electronic fingerprints and physical proof the task force required to nail Travis and Chloe right alongside Liam. The room fell into a heavy, contemplative silence. The agents discussed securing court-ordered wiretaps and waiting for weeks to gather audio proof. But I knew we did not have weeks. I thought about my grandson sitting in that hotel room, his mind fractured by their cruelty. I could not let these monsters dictate the timeline for another single day. I pushed my chair back and stood up the joints in my knees, popping loudly in the quiet room. I looked directly at Agent Miller and told her she did not need to wait for a court-ordered wiretap. I offered to be her catalyst. I told the room of highly trained federal investigators that I was going back into that house. The shock on Martin's face was immediate, but I held up a calloused hand to silence his protests. I knew my son better than anyone else on this earth. I knew his arrogant, fragile ego, and exactly how to shatter his illusion of control. I told the task force that if I walked through that front door and casually revealed that I had completely bypassed his commercial security lock, mirrored his hidden servers, and possessed the exact coordinates of his tropical escape, he would completely lose his mind. He would immediately call Travis in a blind panic. They would scramble to move the money while I was standing right there. Agent Miller immediately shook her head, strictly forbidding the idea. She argued that inserting a civilian, let alone a man pushing 70 into the center of a collapsing criminal syndicate, was a massive operational liability. She warned me that these were desperate, dangerous people who had millions of dollars on the line. If I cornered them, the situation could easily turn violent. But I stood my ground with an unyielding, immovable resolve. I explained that Liam did not see me as a threat. He saw me as a broken, naive old mechanic whom he had easily manipulated and bled dry. That blinding arrogance was their ultimate weakness. They would never suspect I was acting as a federal informant until the handcuffs were actively snapping shut around their wrists. I looked Agent Miller squarely in the eye and told her that I had spent my entire life protecting my family, and I was not about to stop now. I demanded she wire me up. After a tense, whispered consultation with her superiors, Agent Miller finally agreed. The atmosphere in the room transformed into a rapid, highly coordinated military operation. 2 technical specialists entered the conference room, carrying sleek black equipment cases. They asked me to unbutton my worn flannel shirt. With quick professional efficiency, they secured a microscopic audio and video transmitter directly against my chest, taping the thin, flesh-colored wires securely to my skin. The device was remarkably small, practically invisible, but it represented the entire weight of the United States justice system. They equipped me with a tiny concealed earpiece so the tactical team could monitor my safety and communicate in real time. Agent Miller walked me through the strict operational protocols. She instructed me to keep them talking, to explicitly mention the offshore accounts by name, and to force Travis to acknowledge the illegal wire transfers on the recording. As they finished taping the wire to my chest, a profound chill washed over my aging body. I was a simple man who had spent 4 decades diagnosing shattered diesel engines and welding broken steel. I had never imagined myself participating in a high-stakes federal sting operation against my own flesh and blood. But as I buttoned my shirt over the hidden microphone, I felt an incredible surge of raw protective power. I pictured Leo hiding behind the velvet curtains, terrified of the monsters in his basement. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated evil required to break a child's spirit for the sake of dirty money. My grief and betrayal completely hardened into a weaponized focus. I was not walking into that house as a victim, and I was not walking in as a grieving father. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. Martin placed a steady, reassuring hand on my shoulder as we walked out of the federal building and descended into the underground parking garage. He promised me that a fully armed tactical team would be positioned completely out of sight, just blocks away from Liam's mansion, waiting for my signal. I climbed back into the driver's seat of my rusted pickup truck, gripping the steering wheel with hands that were surprisingly steady. The rain had completely cleared, leaving the evening sky painted in bruised shades of purple and dark gray. I turned the ignition, the familiar rumble of the diesel engine filling the concrete structure. I drove out into the fading light, heading back to the sprawling suburban fortress where this nightmare had begun. I was ready to pull the pin on the grenade and watch my son's entire empire blow apart. The cold, worn plastic of my steering wheel felt completely different beneath my calloused hands right now. In the past, it was just a simple, familiar tool used to guide my rusted pickup truck from one heavy repair job to another. Today, it was the helm of a warship. I sat parked a few blocks away from the federal building with the engine idling in that steady, rhythmic diesel hum I knew so well. The heavy rain had finally cleared out, but the evening sky remained a bruised, threatening mixture of purple and dark gray. I took a long, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my burning lungs, and prepared myself for the greatest performance of my entire life. The microscopic federal wire taped securely against my chest felt like an impenetrable shield of armor. Agent Miller was listening. Martin was listening. An entire tactical team was waiting in the shadows for my signal, but the very first move was entirely mine. I pulled my battered cell phone from my flannel pocket and stared down at the glowing screen. My thumb hovered over the contacts list. I did not dial my son. Liam was too close to the center and too arrogant, and he might just brush me off or tell Chloe to lock the front door. No, I needed the weakest link. I needed the man who was already sweating over a sudden federal regulatory inquiry and the man who would panic at the absolute slightest shift in the wind. I tapped the contact name for Travis. The phone rang 3 agonizingly slow times before the line finally clicked open. Travis answered with a sharp, highly irritated bark, clearly annoyed at being interrupted during his frantic preparations. He snapped my name, asking what I wanted, and rudely reminding me that he was in the middle of extremely crucial business. I immediately shrank my voice, pouring every single ounce of manufactured frailty confusion and elderly exhaustion into my vocal cords. I made my breathing sound incredibly shallow and erratic, perfectly mimicking an old man completely overwhelmed by a simple, foolish mistake. I stammered, apologizing profusely for bothering him on such a busy weekday. I told him I was supposed to be on my way up to the lake with my old union buddy Charlie and little Leo, but we had hit a serious, frustrating snag. I injected a slight trembling wheeze into my words, complaining that my memory just was not what it used to be, and I had done something incredibly foolish. Travis sighed loudly into the receiver, and the sound dripped with thick, patronizing disgust. He demanded to know what I had forgotten, practically speaking to me like a toddler who had accidentally spilled a glass of milk on the floor. I let a long, pathetic pause stretch over the line perfectly, ensuring the federal agents monitoring the call caught every single second of his immense condescension. I told him I had forgotten my daily blood pressure medication. I explained in a wavering tone that without those specific pills my heart flutters wildly, and I get terrible dizzy spells, making a weekend trip out in the deep woods far too dangerous. I rambled slightly, playing the exact part of a disorganized, bumbling old fool. I detailed how I had been looking for a simple push broom earlier that morning to sweep up some mud I accidentally tracked into the back mudroom. I told him I had wandered down into the basement utility closet, thinking Chloe might have stored the cleaning supplies down there to keep them out of sight from her wealthy friends. I heard a sudden, incredibly sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The ambient background noise of Travis aggressively shuffling documents abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and thick with sudden, unadulterated terror. He asked me with his voice suddenly dropping an entire octave, exactly what I was doing wandering around in the basement. I kept my tone perfectly naive and utterly oblivious to his rapidly mounting panic. I mumbled that I was just looking around the utility room trying to be helpful, and I must have set my little brown medicine bottle down on one of those metal storage racks while I was moving heavy boxes out of my way. Then I casually dropped the lit match directly into the gasoline. I told Travis that I was terribly confused by what I saw down there in the dark. I described the heavy steel security door being propped open by a stray paint can, which was a sloppy oversight they must have made during their frantic late-night packing. I told him I saw a whole row of weird blinking computers and machines that looked way too complicated and expensive for a normal residential house glowing with strange blue and green lights in the shadows. I let my voice waver with genuine-sounding fatherly concern. I added that I had also noticed a heavy metal floor safe left wide open, and inside there were massive, tightly bound stacks of crisp green paper. I told him it looked like hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure cash just sitting there exposed in the damp basement. I asked Travis, with my voice trembling with artificial terrified fear, if Liam was in some kind of terrible, dangerous trouble. I asked if my son was mixed up with violent loan sharks or illegal underground gambling rings, because normal, honest people absolutely do not keep blinking server racks and massive bricks of cash hidden behind reinforced steel doors. Travis did not immediately answer my questions. He was completely and utterly speechless. I could practically hear his violently elevated heart rate thumping through the small phone speaker. The sheer unimaginable horror of a bumbling old mechanic accidentally stumbling upon their highly classified multi-million-dollar money laundering operation had paralyzed him. Before he could even begin to formulate a deceptive lie, I delivered the final fatal blow. I told him I was turning my rusted truck around right now. I stated firmly that I was driving straight back to the sprawling mansion to talk to Liam face to face and to demand the absolute truth about the blinking computers and the hidden money. I said I was only 10 minutes away, and I was marching straight down to that basement to get my pills and get some honest answers. Travis finally broke his silence, shouting my name in absolute blind screaming panic and ordering me to stay in my truck and not go anywhere near the house. I ignored his frantic, desperate screaming. I simply lowered the phone and pressed the end call button, cutting him off mid-sentence. The trap was flawlessly set. The panic was entirely real. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, shifted my truck into drive, and headed straight for the grand finale. Inside the unmarked federal surveillance van, parked discreetly down the street, the silence was absolutely thick with anticipation. Martin sat right beside me, his eyes locked firmly onto the glowing green audio receiver resting on the reinforced metal dashboard. Agent Miller was in the back, her large black headphones pressed tightly against her ears, and her posture was rigid with intense focus. The tiny microphone taped securely to my chest was doing exactly what we needed it to do. But the real magic was happening over the federal wiretaps. They had just rushed to activate on Travis and Liam. I had just hung up the phone on Travis, leaving him drowning in the terrifying reality that a bumbling old mechanic had stumbled directly into his multi-million-dollar money laundering sanctuary. Over the encrypted federal feed, we could hear the immediate chaotic aftermath of my perfectly executed phone call. Travis was breathing incredibly hard, the sound coming through the high-definition speakers in ragged, terrified gasps. We heard the violent crash of heavy office furniture being shoved aside, and the frantic, desperate sound of expensive glass shattering against a hardwood floor. He was completely losing his mind. A man who had spent his entire adult life hiding behind complex digital algorithms and offshore shell companies was now utterly paralyzed by the simple, terrifying threat of an old man wandering back into a damp basement. We listened closely as Travis wildly punched the buttons on his phone, the loud dial tone ringing out clearly through the surveillance van. He was calling my son. Liam answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with that same arrogant, untouchable confidence I had grown to absolutely despise. He casually asked Travis if the final offshore financial transfers were completely ready for manual authorization. Travis did not calmly respond to the question. He exploded into a breathless, high-pitched scream. He yelled that their entire criminal operation was severely compromised and that my son's idiotic father had just wandered into the utility room looking for a broom and saw the blinking servers. He shrieked that I had seen the open, heavy floor safe and the massive bricks of cash. The dead silence that followed from Liam was incredibly heavy. It was the beautiful, deeply satisfying sound of a ruthless predator finally realizing he had just stepped blindly into a steel-jawed trap. When Liam finally spoke again, his icy and controlled demeanor had completely vanished. He cursed with a violent, animalistic fury that echoed loudly in our van. He demanded to know how the reinforced steel security door had been left carelessly open. Travis screamed right back, his voice cracking with pure terror, explicitly blaming Liam for rushing the packing process, and angrily blaming Chloe for constantly demanding access to the emergency cash reserves. The federal agents in the van exchanged highly satisfied, knowing glances. The pristine, impenetrable wall of trust between these arrogant, white-collar criminals was rapidly disintegrating right before our eyes. Greed is an incredibly fragile glue, and the very second genuine danger appears, rats will always violently turn on each other to save themselves. The audio feed suddenly picked up the loud sound of a wooden door violently banging open on Liam's end of the connection. Chloe had clearly heard the intense screaming from down the hallway. We could hear her shrill, panicked voice echoing sharply in the background, aggressively demanding to know exactly what was happening. Liam shouted back that my stupid, meddling presence had just ruined everything they had worked for. Chloe completely lost her mind. She shrieked at the top of her lungs that she was absolutely not going to a federal prison just because a useless old mechanic could not remember where he left his blood pressure pills. She aggressively blamed Travis for being a sloppy amateur and viciously blamed Liam for not locking me away in a state-run nursing home 3 days earlier. They were viciously tearing each other apart. The meticulously crafted illusion of their high society lives was entirely stripped away, revealing the pathetic, terrified cowards hiding underneath the designer clothes. Travis cut through this chaotic screaming with a terrified, breathless declaration. He reminded both of them that I was currently driving my truck back to the mansion. He frantically outlined his absolute worst nightmare scenario over the phone. He said that if a naive old man saw illegal computers and massive stacks of unexplained money, my very first instinct would be to call the local police out of genuine, misguided paternal concern. He yelled that I would probably wave a local patrol officer right down into the basement just to make sure my successful son was not in any physical danger from violent loan sharks. The sheer blinding panic in his voice was absolute music to my aging ears. They genuinely believed their entire criminal syndicate was about to be completely exposed by an accidental well-meaning phone call to the local municipal authorities. Liam took aggressive control of the panicked conversation, screaming for everyone to shut up. We heard him barking rapid, desperate orders. He told Travis to get his private moving crew to the mansion immediately. They could not wait for the scheduled weekend extraction. They had to move the illegal servers, the encrypted hard drives, and the physical cash right now tonight, before I could return and stumble back into the basement with the police. Liam ordered Travis to bring his unmarked cargo vans and transfer every single piece of incriminating evidence directly across town to his heavily fortified commercial warehouse. They would pack the servers, load the money, and completely disappear before the old man ever made it back to the concrete driveway. The audio feed was instantly filled with the frantic rushing sounds of coats being zipped, keys jingling, and heavy doors slamming shut. We could hear Liam shouting at Chloe to pack her luxury bags and get ready to head straight for the private airstrip the very second the servers were safely secured at the warehouse. They were running. The catalyst had worked perfectly. They were abandoning their careful security protocols and blindly rushing out into the open, carrying the exact physical evidence the federal government needed to lock them away for decades. Agent Miller reached forward and adjusted the volume knob on the receiver, a tight, highly professional smile finally breaking across her face. She picked up her tactical radio and calmly ordered all federal field units to immediately converge on Travis's commercial warehouse. The beautiful, inescapable trap was officially sprung, and my son was driving right into the jaws of absolute justice. The digital clock glowing softly on the command van dashboard flipped to 2 in the morning. Outside the heavily tinted windows, a torrential downpour was absolutely punishing the dark suburban streets. The sky had completely opened up, releasing a blinding sheet of heavy water that pounded against the reinforced metal roof of our surveillance vehicle with a deafening, continuous roar. It was the kind of fierce, unforgiving midnight storm that forces normal, honest people deep into their warm beds. But tonight, that violent weather was our greatest tactical advantage. It perfectly masked the low, stealthy rumble of 36 unmarked federal vehicles methodically sealing off every single escape route around my son's sprawling neighborhood. I sat perfectly still in the cramped back section of the mobile command center, shoulder to shoulder with Martin and Agent Miller. The air inside the tight space was thick with the sharp metallic scent of damp tactical gear and the electric hum of high-grade surveillance equipment. A glowing wall of interconnected monitors illuminated our faces in harsh shades of pale green and bright blue, feeding us a flawless high-definition live stream of the trap we had so carefully laid. We were watching the nightmare actively unfold exactly as we had predicted. The hidden cameras, seamlessly positioned by the advanced tactical team, captured the frantic, desperate chaos exploding inside Liam's manicured mansion. My son, the polished, arrogant corporate executive who had always looked down his nose at my greasy mechanic boots, was completely falling apart. His expensive tailored suit jacket was gone. His crisp designer shirt was soaked in terrified sweat and plastered tightly against his back. He was barking panicked, ragged orders at Travis while clumsily dragging massive reinforced black Pelican cases up the steep basement stairs. Those heavy cases were the physical heartbeat of their entire criminal money laundering empire. They contained the illegal encrypted servers, the deeply hidden offshore banking ledgers, and the massive bricks of stolen cash they had systematically siphoned from innocent people. Travis looked even worse. The confident, untouchable financial architect was reduced to a stumbling, breathless mess. He was slipping on the polished hardwood floors of the foyer, violently cursing every time a heavy server rack violently banged against the pristine white walls. They were moving with a reckless, blind urgency, fueled entirely by the manufactured terror I had planted in their minds. They genuinely believed a confused old man was going to show up with a local police cruiser at any given second. They were completely abandoning all of their sophisticated high-tech security protocols in favor of raw, brute force. It was incredibly pathetic to witness. All their immense wealth, all their calculated corporate arrogance had ultimately boiled down to two terrified thieves desperately hauling dirty money through a dark hallway in the middle of a thunderstorm. Even Chloe was pulled directly into the grueling physical labor. The woman who had spent months complaining about the unbearable burden of my presence was now frantically pushing a loaded hand truck across the rain-slicked driveway. Her expensive salon-styled hair was plastered wildly against her face by the driving rain. Her designer shoes slipped and slid dangerously on the wet concrete as she struggled to balance a heavy waterproof tote bag overflowing with bundled $100 bills. She was screaming frantically at Liam, telling him to hurry up and secure the cargo before they lost their narrow window to escape. They had backed a generic, unmarked rental moving truck straight up to the massive double front doors, leaving the cargo ramp deployed directly on the front porch. It was an incredibly sloppy, desperate maneuver designed for absolute speed over stealth. I sat rigidly in the rolling command center, my eyes absolutely glued to the primary surveillance feed. Every single time a heavy black case was violently shoved up the metal ramp and into the back of that rented truck, my chest tightened with an overwhelming mixture of profound sorrow and deep righteous satisfaction. I was watching my own flesh and blood completely destroy his life. I was watching the boy I had raised, the son I had sacrificed my back and my knees to put through expensive universities willingly trade his entire soul for stolen wealth. But I also knew exactly what was hidden away safely in a warm hotel room across town. I thought about little Leo sleeping soundly under the protective watch of a kind retired nurse far away from the monsters who had tortured him. That singular thought completely solidified the iron resolve burning deep in my gut. Liam had made his monstrous choices. Now he was going to face the absolute devastating consequences of his greed. The federal agents surrounding me were a portrait of cold, disciplined patience. Agent Miller sat with her hand hovering gently over the main communication console, her sharp eyes tracking every single movement on the glowing monitors. She was silently counting the heavy Pelican cases, making absolutely certain the entire criminal syndicate and all their illicit assets were fully exposed and physically loaded into the unsecure transport vehicle. We needed them completely committed. We needed the illegal servers unplugged and the cash violently removed from the protected domestic sanctuary of the house. They were doing exactly what Trustee Vance had predicted. They were handing the federal government an airtight, flawlessly packaged conviction on a silver platter. On the bright surveillance screen, Travis hoisted the very last heavy server case onto his trembling shoulders. He staggered blindly out the front door, his boots splashing loudly through the deep puddles forming on the concrete porch. Liam was right behind him, carrying a heavy metal lockbox, practically shoving Travis up the metal ramp in his blind desperation to flee. Chloe was already climbing frantically into the passenger seat of the rental truck, slamming the heavy door shut against the punishing rain. Travis violently shoved the final piece of their criminal enterprise into the dark cargo hold and turned to grab the heavy metal sliding door to pull it shut. That was the exact, precise moment they officially crossed the threshold of no return. Agent Miller leaned slightly forward and pressed the transmit button on her communication console. She spoke a single sharp word into her microphone. The execution of that simple command was absolutely instantaneous and breathtakingly violent. The dark storm-soaked suburban street suddenly erupted into blinding daylight. Massive high-intensity tactical floodlights mounted on the hidden federal vehicles simultaneously ignited, cutting through the torrential rain with a searing, unmistakable brilliance. The harsh white beams completely engulfed the rented moving truck, and the sprawling front driveway pinning my son and his accomplices in a devastating, inescapable circle of absolute illumination. The deafening blast of federal sirens shattered the heavy suburban night like a pane of glass. Red and blue emergency lights instantly joined the blinding white floodlights bouncing violently off the sheets of pouring rain and painting Liam's pristine concrete driveway in the frantic colors of absolute justice. I watched through the thick tinted window of the command van as dozens of heavily armed agents poured out of their unmarked vehicles. They moved with a terrifying synchronized precision, shouting thunderous commands that completely drowned out the roaring thunderstorm. The trap had not just sprung. It had clamped down with the crushing, inescapable force of a steel jaw. Travis was the very first to break. The brilliant financial mastermind, the arrogant architect of offshore shell companies and untraceable ledgers completely lost his nerve. He dropped the heavy metal lockbox he was holding, letting it crash violently against the wet asphalt, and bolted. He made a desperate, panicked sprint toward the side gate, frantically trying to disappear into the pitch-black darkness of the sprawling backyard. But federal tactical teams do not leave open doors. 3 agents wearing heavy tactical gear intercepted him before he even cleared the edge of the manicured lawn. They tackled him hard, sending his expensive suit plunging directly into the deep, churning mud. I watched the monitors with intense satisfaction as they pinned his arms behind his back, pressing his face firmly into the dirt, while snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The untouchable corporate ghost was now just another common criminal weeping in the rain. The immediate betrayal by Chloe was equally spectacular. The second the federal agent swarmed the back of the rented moving truck, her carefully maintained illusion of high society loyalty instantly vaporized. She did not rush to comfort her husband. She did not stand by the man who had funded her extravagant hollow lifestyle. Instead, she backed away from Liam as if he were carrying a deadly plague. She threw her hands high up into the air, screaming hysterically over the deafening sirens. Her voice was shrill and desperate as she cried out to the approaching officers, frantically claiming absolute innocence. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my son, hysterically sobbing that she had absolutely no idea what was inside those heavy black cases. She aggressively threw Liam entirely to the wolves, screeching that he had forced her to pack her bags, that he was a monster, and that she was merely a victim of his terrifying financial schemes. She was begging for mercy, entirely willing to watch the man she supposedly loved burn to the ground if it meant saving her own skin. And then there was my son. Liam did not run. He did not scream. He did not even attempt to defend himself against Chloe's vicious, frantic accusations. He simply stood completely frozen on the edge of the cargo ramp, the pouring rain rapidly soaking through his thin designer shirt. The blinding tactical floodlights illuminated a face stripped completely bare of all its customary arrogance and toxic pride. His broad shoulders slumped. His jaw hung slack, and his eyes darted wildly around the swarming federal agents as his sophisticated, untouchable world rapidly dissolved into absolute ruin. The mighty billionaire, the man who had coldly plotted to lock his own father in a chemical prison and discard his innocent, traumatized son in a remote facility, was entirely paralyzed by the crushing reality of his total defeat. I placed my hand firmly on the heavy metal latch of the command van door. Agent Miller gave me a silent, respectful nod, fully understanding that this final crucial moment belonged entirely to me. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the raging storm. The cold, driving rain hit my face instantly, but I did not feel the chill. I felt a profound, purifying warmth burning deep within my chest. My worn leather boots splashed heavily against the flooded asphalt as I walked slowly and deliberately across the chaotic driveway. I bypassed the shouting federal agents, ignoring the frantic, pathetic sobbing of Chloe and the muffled curses of Travis. I kept my eyes locked with unyielding, righteous focus directly on the broken man standing near the back of the moving truck. Liam finally noticed my approach through the blinding glare of the lights. For a brief, agonizingly confused second, his terrified expression shifted. I could see the gears turning in his panicked mind. He still believed the old, naive facade. He probably thought his bumbling, foolish father had accidentally called the local municipal police out of genuine, misguided concern and triggered a terrible misunderstanding. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, silently begging me to clear up the confusion, to play the role of the protective father and shield him from the terrifying consequences of his actions. I stopped less than 3 feet away from him, letting the heavy rain wash over my calloused face. I did not offer him comfort. I did not offer him a single ounce of paternal mercy. I simply squared my shoulders, looked him dead in his terrified eyes, and let my voice cut through the roaring storm with absolute chilling clarity. I checked the basement. Those 4 simple words struck him with the devastating, catastrophic force of a physical blow. The last lingering trace of hope completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, bottomless horror. I watched the exact moment his arrogant mind entirely broke. He realized in that split second that the foolish, discarded old mechanic he had so ruthlessly exploited was the absolute architect of his ultimate downfall. He realized I had actively played him, mirroring his hidden servers, photographing his stolen wealth, and orchestrating a massive federal sting operation right under his nose, his knees buckled slightly, his chest heaving with silent, ragged sobs, as two federal agents stepped forward to aggressively pull his arms behind his back. I turned away, the heavy rain washing my soul completely clean, walking back toward the van, knowing my grandson and I were finally permanently free. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse swung shut with a resounding thud that felt like a judge bringing down a final heavy gavel. It was a stark, unforgiving environment, a cathedral of cold, polished marble, echoing hallways, and absolute, undeniable authority. We were miles away from the muddy, rain-soaked driveway where my son's empire had violently collapsed just weeks prior. I sat perfectly still in the gallery of the grand courtroom, dressed in my best Sunday suit, my calloused hands resting calmly on my knees. I was not there to speak, nor was I there to beg or negotiate. I was simply there to bear witness to the absolute, methodical dismantling of a criminal syndicate engineered by the very men who thought they could throw me away like garbage. Liam and Travis sat at the defense table, wearing bright orange jumpsuits that severely clashed with their lingering aura of corporate arrogance. They looked completely exhausted, their faces hollow and pale under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The sheer gravity of the federal justice system had already begun to physically crush them. The proceedings began not as a criminal trial, but as the scheduled hearing for Liam's fraudulent corporate bankruptcy. He had foolishly hoped this would be a routine rubber stamp, a simple legal maneuver to erase his massive debts before fleeing the country. Instead, the presiding bankruptcy judge took one look at the federal prosecutor, stepping confidently into the room, and immediately halted the entire farce. The atmosphere shifted from bureaucratic boredom to electrifying tension in a matter of seconds. The prosecutor, armed with thick, heavy binders of irrefutable evidence, formally unsealed the federal indictments. As the extensive list of charges was read aloud, the air in the courtroom seemed to grow incredibly thin and suffocating. Federal wire fraud, international money laundering, massive corporate embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. Every single word was a heavy iron nail driven deep into their coffins. My son stared blankly ahead, his jaw locked tight, as the meticulously constructed illusion of his untouchable wealth was publicly shredded into a million worthless pieces. He was no longer a brilliant billionaire entrepreneur. He was just a common thief caught dead to rights. The true devastation came when the forensic accountants took the floor. Martin had done his job with devastating surgical precision. Alongside Trustee Vance, they laid out the sprawling complex web of offshore shell companies and untraceable cryptocurrency wallets that Travis had so arrogantly designed. They did not just expose the stolen money, they explicitly detailed how they had successfully clawed every single cent back. Through highly coordinated international cooperation, federal authorities had successfully frozen the Cayman accounts, seized the tropical real estate, and completely drained the syndicate's illicit war chest. Travis physically slumped over the defense table, burying his face in his trembling hands as he listened to the methodical erasure of his entire life's work. The untouchable paradise they had planned to escape to was entirely gone, replaced by the terrifying, inescapable reality of concrete cells and barbed wire fences. They had absolutely nothing left to barter, with no hidden safety nets, and absolutely nowhere left to run. If Liam held on to any lingering, desperate hope that his incredibly expensive, high-powered defense attorneys could somehow weave a miraculous legal loophole, that fragile delusion was swiftly and brutally shattered. The prosecution did not hold back. They seamlessly presented the cloned digital servers I had smuggled out of the basement. They displayed the high-resolution photographs of the banded cash sitting exposed in the heavy floor safe. But the ultimate, absolutely crushing blow was the audio recording from the federal wire I had worn against my chest. The courtroom sat in dead, echoing silence as Travis and his panicked, breathless voice filled the room, explicitly detailing their frantic plans to move the servers and the cash. We heard Chloe screaming about fleeing the country, and we heard my son barking desperate orders to hide the stolen millions from the authorities. The evidence was completely and utterly insurmountable. The high-priced lawyers sitting next to Liam and Travis exchanged grim, defeated glances. They were seasoned professionals who only fought battles they knew they could win. Within minutes of the presentation, the lead defense attorney requested a brief recess, and it became immediately obvious that they were actively preparing to abandon a sinking ship. They began advising their clients to seek unconditional plea deals, knowing full well that a drawn-out public trial would only result in maximum catastrophic sentences. When the judge finally addressed the massive collateral damage caused by their greed, my heart began to pound a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. The prosecutor handed over a specific, detailed file regarding the theft of my life savings. The judge adjusted his glasses, his stern gaze sweeping across the courtroom before locking directly onto my son. With a voice carrying the heavy, unyielding weight of absolute justice, he declared the original foreclosure on my family home to be entirely fraudulent and entirely null and void. He legally reversed the seizure, officially returning the property deed firmly back into my name. But he did not stop there. He ordered that the $300,000 Liam had maliciously stolen from my bank account be immediately returned in full, heavily padded, with years of compensatory interest as direct restitution. I sat in the gallery taking a long, deep breath of the sterile, conditioned air. My calloused hands remained perfectly steady. I had walked into my son's house as a broken, discarded old man crippled by grief and blinded by familial trust. I was walking out of this federal courthouse as a man who had fought a brutal war for his own survival and completely won. I looked down at my grandson, little Leo, sitting quietly beside me, and I knew that our new life was finally about to begin. The heavy oak doors of the county family court felt entirely different from the grand marble entrances of the federal building. Federal court was about recovering stolen money and enforcing concrete financial statutes, but this small clinical room was about the delicate, fragile matters of the human soul. I sat at the petitioner table alongside my legal counsel and the court-appointed guardian ad litem representing my grandson. The air was thick and suffocating. The side door creaked open, and the bailiff led Liam and Chloe into the room. They were no longer the impeccably dressed, arrogant corporate elites who had sneered at my worn flannel shirts. They shuffled forward in bright orange county jumpsuits, their wrists and ankles bound in heavy steel transport chains. The sharp metallic clinking of their shackles echoed loudly against the linoleum floor, a beautiful symphony of systemic karma, finally balancing the scales. The hollow, defeated look in my son's eyes told me that the crushing weight of his inevitable prolonged incarceration had completely broken his spirit. The superficial illusion of his billionaire lifestyle had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic, shivering reality of a common criminal. The presiding judge, a stern, deeply experienced magistrate with decades of navigating domestic tragedies, called the session to order. This hearing was the absolute final nail in their collective coffin. The federal authorities had already dismantled their massive financial syndicate, completely freezing their offshore assets and meticulously clawing back every single stolen cent. Now it was time to strip them of the one precious thing they had so carelessly neglected and actively abused. My attorney formally submitted the petition for the permanent and irrevocable termination of their parental rights. We did not rely on emotional hearsay or subjective accusations. We built our case on the absolute unyielding bedrock of concrete digital evidence. We submitted the hidden camera footage I had secretly recorded during those long, terrifying nights in their fraudulent mansion. The bailiff dimmed the overhead lights, and the video began to play on the large monitor positioned directly in front of the elevated bench. The audio was horrifyingly crisp, capturing the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of that house with the terrifying clarity of a professional recording studio. The entire courtroom watched in dead, horrified silence as the screen displayed Chloe leaning over a trembling, paralyzed Leo, aggressively hissing that he was a defective burden who completely ruined her peace. We watched Liam coldly discussing his calculated plans to permanently warehouse his own flesh and blood in a remote lockdown behavioral facility just to keep him quiet before their international escape. The raw, unfiltered psychological abuse radiating from the speakers was profoundly sickening. It was not a sudden explosion of physical violence. It was a methodical daily campaign of emotional destruction explicitly designed to completely erase an innocent child's spirit. I kept my eyes locked firmly on the judge. I watched his seasoned face shift from professional neutrality to absolute visceral disgust. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his temples, visibly repulsed by the staggering cruelty displayed by the two people sitting in chains before him. When the video finally ended, and the harsh fluorescent lights blinked back on the heavy silence in the room, was absolutely deafening. Liam stared down at his shackled hands, entirely unable to lift his head or meet the burning gaze of the magistrate. Chloe wept openly, a pathetic theatrical display of loud sobs that held absolutely zero genuine remorse. They were not crying for the immense pain they had maliciously inflicted upon a vulnerable boy. They were weeping strictly for themselves, mourning the permanent loss of their unearned freedom and the absolute collapse of their massive illegal empire. The judge did not waste a single breath on sympathetic platitudes. His voice thundered through the courtroom with the crushing, inescapable authority of absolute justice. He stated that in all his years on the bench, he had rarely witnessed such a profound, calculated absence of basic parental humanity. He looked directly at Liam and Chloe, systematically condemning their monstrous greed and their horrific betrayal. With a sharp, decisive strike of his wooden gavel, he legally and permanently severed their ties to my grandson. Their parental rights were irrevocably terminated. They were stripped of all legal custody, denied any future visitation, and forbidden from ever contacting Leo again. The bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing Liam and Chloe by their chained arms and dragging them out of the courtroom. They were denied bail, remanded back to federal holding, and marched out into the cold reality of a life behind thick steel bars. They had sacrificed their very souls to steal a fortune, and they were leaving with absolutely nothing. I walked out of that sterile courthouse, holding my grandson's small, warm hand safely in mine. The crushing, heavy burden that had suffocated me for months was entirely gone, completely replaced by a profound, radiant sense of quiet liberation. Real silent wealth is not found in hidden offshore accounts or massive corporate ledgers. It is found in the simple, unbroken bond of absolute trust and enduring love. I looked down at Leo, who was staring up at me with bright, hopeful eyes, and I knew exactly what we were going to do next. We were going to heal, and we were going to explore the vast, beautiful world. I planned to take him far away from the toxic suburban sprawl traveling across the globe to witness monumental feats of engineering, like the massive Millau Viaduct and the incredible Jiaozhou Bay Bridge. I was going to teach him the language of the future Mandarin alongside Italian and German, ensuring his mind expanded far beyond the dark basement where he had been trapped. We were going to build a completely new, vibrant life together based on genuine honesty and unbreakable support. Sometimes the universe forces us to walk through absolute hell just to show us the immense hidden strength we possess. We learn that true justice requires immense patience, meticulous preparation, and the unyielding courage to stand up against the darkness, even when it hides behind the faces of those we once loved. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that the truth always ultimately finds a way to break through the deepest lies, and that protecting the innocent is the greatest, most honorable duty any of us can ever undertake. Please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another journey. Leave a comment down below with your current location and the exact time you are watching this, because I truly love knowing how far my voice has traveled across this beautiful world. Stay strong, protect your loved ones, and I will see you in the next story. The morning air carries the sweet, familiar scent of blooming jasmine and fresh, damp earth. I am standing on the old wooden porch of the home my late wife Sarah and I built with our own 2 hands so many decades ago. The gentle warmth of the early spring sun washes over my calloused face, melting away the last lingering chill of the long, bitter winter. 6 months have passed since that chaotic rain-soaked night when the federal authorities descended upon the driveway and completely shattered my son's fraudulent empire. 6 months of quiet, steady rebuilding. The thick, heavy property deed is firmly and permanently secured back in my name, legally stripped from the greedy hands of those who tried to steal my entire history. The suffocating toxic tension that once poisoned the very air inside these walls has entirely evaporated. It has been entirely replaced by a profound, deep, and absolute healing peace. I spent the first few months engaging in an intense, rigorous physical purge of the house. I methodically ripped out every single piece of sterile, soulless modern furniture that Chloe had arrogantly installed. I carried those sharp, uncomfortable chairs and those ridiculous glass tables straight out to the curb like taking out the trash. I spent weeks down on my hands and knees carefully sanding the beautiful original oak floors that Sarah had loved so much, bringing back the natural golden warmth of the wood. I painted the cold gray walls in soft, inviting colors and laid down thick, comfortable rugs that practically hugged your feet when you walked across them. I wanted to completely erase any lingering trace of their cold, calculating presence. The house breathes again. It smells like roasted chicken and fresh-baked bread instead of expensive synthetic perfumes and empty corporate ambition. It is no longer a fortified, pristine monument to unearned silent wealth. It is a genuine lived-in sanctuary. The legal aftermath of their massive financial deception unfolded with devastating clinical precision. The federal justice system is a slow, grinding machine, but once it locks onto a target, it absolutely refuses to let go. Liam, Chloe, and Travis are currently locked away in separate maximum security federal penitentiaries, serving multi-decade sentences. The irrefutable digital evidence I had meticulously gathered, combined with the desperate, frantic wiretap recordings, left them absolutely zero room to negotiate. Their high-priced defense attorneys recognized a completely unwinnable battle and quickly abandoned them. The entire illegal fraud ring was completely and permanently dismantled. Forensic accountants utilized international warrants to ruthlessly claw back every single cent hidden across their sprawling network of offshore shell accounts. The luxury vehicles were seized and auctioned off by the government. The designer wardrobes were confiscated. The massive tropical real estate holdings were completely liquidated to provide direct restitution to the countless innocent people they had maliciously defrauded. My son now sleeps on a thin, stiff mattress in a concrete cell stripped entirely of his tailored suits and his towering corporate arrogance. I received one single letter from him about 4 months ago. It was written on cheap lined paper, begging for a character reference and pleading for me to understand the immense pressure he had been under. He asked for my forgiveness. He tried to manipulate my paternal instincts one last desperate time. I did not even bother to read the entire pathetic page. I walked straight into the living room and tossed the letter directly into the roaring flames of the brick fireplace, watching the curling black smoke disappear up the chimney. Systemic karma is an absolute unyielding force. They willingly sacrificed their basic human souls and actively plotted to destroy an innocent child, all for the sake of dirty money. Now they possess absolutely nothing but endless decades of quiet isolation to contemplate the monumental scale of their own wicked choices. But the greatest and most profound victory of this entire ordeal has absolutely nothing to do with money or vengeance or prison sentences. The true triumph is the small boy currently sleeping safely in the bedroom right above me. The journey to heal my grandson was incredibly slow and required an immense ocean of patience. When I first brought Leo back home, he was a shattered, terrified shell of a child. The deep psychological abuse inflicted by his own parents had left severe, invisible scars. For the first few weeks, he suffered from agonizing night terrors. He would wake up violently screaming in the middle of the dark night, genuinely believing he was being dragged away to a remote, lockdown behavioral facility. Every single time, I would rush into his room and sit on the edge of his bed, wrapping my thick, heavy arms around his small, trembling body. I would hold him tight and whisper that he was absolutely safe, that his grandfather was standing guard, and that no monster would ever be allowed to cross our threshold again. We found a wonderful, gentle child psychologist who specialized in treating profound emotional trauma. We attended therapy sessions twice a week. Slowly, the heavy, suffocating fear began to loosen its tight grip on his fragile mind. I watched with immense joy as the dark, sunken circles under his eyes gradually faded away, completely replaced by the healthy, rosy flush of an active, growing boy. He stopped flinching whenever a door closed too loudly in the hallway. He began to eat full, hearty meals, asking for second helpings of my homemade meatloaf. I enrolled him in a wonderful local school where the teachers genuinely care about nurturing a child's unique spirit instead of treating them like a burdensome inconvenience. I watched him make new friends and play out in the yard, getting his knees covered in mud exactly the way a normal happy kid should. The old wooden screen door creaks open behind me, breaking the quiet morning silence. I turn around and see Leo stepping out onto the sunlit porch. He is wearing his favorite oversized pajamas and rubbing the sleep from his bright eyes. He walks straight over to me and casually leans his small weight against my side. I wrap my calloused hand securely around his narrow shoulder, pulling him close. He looks up at me, and a wide, genuine smile spreads completely across his face. His voice, which was once so brutally stifled and trapped behind a wall of calculated fear, now rings out clear and strong. He excitedly tells me about a new science project he has to complete for school. He explains with rapid, enthusiastic gestures how he wants to construct a large model bridge out of wooden popsicle sticks and strong glue. He tells me he wants it to be just like the incredible engineering marvels I used to show him pictures of in my old technical magazines. I smile down at him and tell him that we can drive down to the local hardware store right after breakfast to buy all the supplies we need. He cheers loudly and immediately starts talking about how he and his new best friend are going to paint the bridge bright red. Listening to him talk about his simple, innocent dreams fills my chest with an overwhelming, absolute joy. The emotional payoff of this entire grueling ordeal is standing right here holding my hand. I look down at my worn, rough fingers. These tired hands spent over 40 years wrestling with heavy steel beams and rusted diesel engines. They were never meant to navigate the treacherous, sophisticated waters of high-stakes international financial fraud or outsmart brilliant white-collar criminals. But when pure evil invaded my family and threatened to destroy my grandson, those same greasy, tired hands methodically built an inescapable trap. I realize now that a grandfather will always find a way to summon unimaginable strength when an innocent child is placed in danger. We did not simply punish the wicked. We actively saved a beautiful, precious human life. We rescued a future that was about to be discarded for the sake of an offshore bank account. I take a slow sip of my hot coffee and watch the neighborhood birds flutter across the green lawn. A foundation built on absolute betrayal and boundless greed will always inevitably crumble when the ultimate truth comes knocking at the front door. Never underestimate the quiet, observant ones sitting in the background, listening and taking notes. And absolutely never mistake an old man's deep, profound love for his family for weakness. If you believe that karma eventually balances the scales of the universe, and that true righteous justice belongs exclusively to those who bravely stand up for the innocent, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Let me know in the comments exactly what city you are watching from and what time it is right now in your part of the world. It fills this grateful grandfather's heart with immense joy to see exactly how far our stories travel across the globe. Stay strong, protect your own family with everything you have, and I will see you in the next story.